Alright, let's get started here soon. What else do I need? Top edge. There you go. And welcome back, peeps and poops. This is Lubaloo transmitting at 52 Hertz. Make no mistake, this is a 52 Hertz transmission. Alright, we're gonna continue with Naraka. So I was doing Showdown. Hard as Kurumi, huh? Okay. I gotta go hard as Kurumi. Should be okay.
Does this mean I have to share whatever we win?
Atari.
Kurumi, Tsuchimikado, the Onmyoji. Smart beginnings make good endings. And I'm very smart.
No, I said Kurumi. What the hell? No. Go ahead and put it on a podcast. Nice, interesting podcast. to go to my playlists. Mm,
women's spaces are the fetishistic transvestites.
The people with AGP
Yeah.
that get sexually aroused by imagining
Having a vagina whilst masturbating their penis.
we're going there, aren't we?
State-sanctioned child abuse. These are childhood experiments. A lot of them will just be gay.
Let's give you some therapy before you go and get your dick chopped off.
They have a new diagnostic category called eunuch gender. Boys who identify as eunuchs, and the recommended treatment is to have a physical castration. There's no lower age limit. Yes, there's madness, but the madness isn't located in the transsexual. The madness is located in the people around them, like the Emperor's New Clothes. I think what's really disturbing is when you see biological men going through the motions of breastfeeding a newborn infant.
And what about the transition, the process from a woman to a man?
Well, that's worse.
How could it possibly be worse? I want to say a quick thank you to our sponsors, Gold Seal. I use their products every single day, and now I finally get to work with them. I use their products for anti-inflammatory, reduced anxiety, better sleep, and mental clarity. I'm going to put a link to their website in the description, along with a 10% discount code for you to take advantage of. Go and have a look at their website, see if there's anything in there for you. I hope you enjoy this week's episode, and good health. Az,
Liam,
thank you for coming on.
thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm intrigued to pick your brains. You're the author of D-Trans. When transition is not the solution, and there's an increasing number of people thinking they've been born in the wrong body, which is madness to me, and you're in the top 10
Kill list.
kill list for the trans
Activists.
the trans terrorists, you call them.
I call them trans-terrorists because they do aim to terrorise people. They're not just disgruntled, but when they get their sights on you, they want to annihilate you. They want to destroy your career, destroy your life. Online, you can see this guide for how to destroy a TERF's life and how to, set their car on fire, find out where they live, dox them, tell the world where their children are. They're terrorists.
I didn't know that. Well, I've interviewed a trans woman and a trans man, so which is why I'm very interested to hear it from a professional's perspective rather than, because both of them have said to me that they've got mental health issues, which is crystal clear. For a man to want to remove his genitalia, it's insanity, and I do feel very sorry for them because I couldn't begin to imagine that. But really, it's the trans terrorists that I'm interested in, because they've both kind of denounced the ideology, the movement. They don't want it slipstreaming into schools like we've seen. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, just give me a summary of your background so the audience know just how qualified you are.
So primarily I'm a doctor. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I did higher training in forensic psychotherapy, so it's psychotherapy for populations for whom usual psychotherapists don't go near. So violence, delinquency, sexual perversions, and I also did gender. And I'm the only consultant psychiatrist in Britain who specialises in psychotherapy for adults with gender problems. And I single-handedly set up and ran a specialist service in the UK for 12 years until I left the NHS. Now I'm solely in private practice, and the political climate is so precarious for doing psychotherapy with gender that any gender work I do now is focused on things like this: podcasts, teaching, talking, writing about it, and helping parents try and think about what on earth their children are doing to themselves.
I'm very grateful for people like you, because I feel like the parents are being indoctrinated in one lane and the kids are being indoctrinated in another, and it's kind of the imperfect storm, and it's become very politicised as well. What do you think about the The Supreme Court ruling that's just passed. The
Court
common
ju-
sense Supreme Court
It was
ruling.
absolutely common sense. It took a Supreme Court in the land to tell us what we all knew, that a woman is a biological adult female and a man is a human biological male. And you can't get a piece of paper or certificate or just pretend or wish you were otherwise to change that. You know, biology is fact.
You mentioned that they come for your livelihood and they want to destroy you. That sounds a little bit like the radical left.
Well, I don't know whether they're left or right or just, but the core thing is that for those who would formerly be called transsexuals, and I'll come on to the different subtypes, what I found in my service was that 100% of the male transsexuals, as in the people who permanently wanted to change their bodies, were on the autistic spectrum. And the thing about autism is that when you get angry and annoyed, you become nuclear. So you see in autistic children have autistic meltdowns when, you know, the baked beans are touching their fish fingers. They have this completely inappropriately strong meltdown, nuclear proportions. And you see it when people say, oh, you got my pronouns wrong, and they start all those videos of those college kids in America screaming because they got the pronouns wrong. So that's an autistic meltdown. And so when you're having an autistic meltdown, you just want to destroy. You don't want to just upset, you want to destroy. And that's what you see in those instances.
That makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. And also, if you call them by their birth name, they call it their dead name, didn't they? They take extreme umbrage to that. Whereas to someone like
So
me...
if you've really invested in the idea of living in a fantasy version of yourself, then any evidence that anyone may not be colluding with that is threatening to their core. Whereas in reality, yes, they were that person, they still are that person, they've got a different name, the same person. And the thing about pronouns, which I can explain why it's so important, is, do you want to do that bit?
Please.
Yeah, so the thing about, so if you go back to me saying that the male transsexual, because it's not so much always the case in the female, but the male transsexual, I would argue, is always on the autistic spectrum. And the core deficit with autism is you don't have this thing called theory of mind. So you have no idea of gauging what's in someone else's head in terms of what they're thinking or feeling, which comes naturally to people who aren't on the spectrum. So, you know, if something happens and I'm a bit peeved or upset, you'll probably get a sense that I'm peeved or upset, or you'll gauge that. But they can't work it out. So for them, let's say if I wanted to be a woman and I said, you know, refer to me in she, her pronouns, and you did, that to the autistic person would be evidence that you really do believe that I'm a woman because you're using she, her pronouns. The part that I told you to and you're doing it because you're polite doesn't come into it. So if you start using she, her pronouns to me, if you suddenly slip up and say he, then that's an indication that you don't really believe that I'm a woman, which is really upsetting. So it's not about grammar. I mean, the pronoun has never been so well known worldwide. Nobody knew what pronouns were before. But it's an indication of, for them, a concrete indication of what someone else is thinking in relation to them. So, for example, I had a patient who said, I went out last night, you know, cross-dressed, as a woman, went out for dinner, and nobody even considered that I was male. And I said, how do you know? He said, well, because nobody said anything. I said, well, and the waiter came up to me and said, you know, have you got do you want your like to eat, Mum? And I said, but is that what you're going by? And they said, yeah, but I was wearing a dress, I had long hair, had makeup, and people didn't question it. So that, because there was no concrete evidence, they believed everyone must believe I'm, because the formula's there. I look like a woman, they're saying all the right things, therefore I must. They'd have to deduce it. Mm. Whereas the fact that somebody could internally be thinking something otherwise and different to what they're saying outwardly didn't occur. So that's the pronoun thing. And it's all about not being able to gauge what other people think in relation to them.
Okay, so what's the difference? So you've got transsexuals, transgenders, transvestites.
It's really confusing, isn't it? So you've got this new term, transgender, which is entirely unhelpful, because before then, you'd had distinct categories which were clearer. So you had transsexuals. There was always a very small number of those. They were people who, either male or female, wanted to permanently exit their sex and become the opposite sex. then you've always had a huge number of transvestites. And they're usually men who get excited, either sexually or otherwise, by temporarily residing in the vestiges, transvestite, clothing or spaces of the other sex. Then there's a very small number of autogynephiles, and I've revised, it was a term coined by Blanchard, and he talked of a number of different types of autogynephile. I've revised it, and all these 20-year-olds on YouTube think I don't understand what an autogynephile is, but I'm just to make it very clear, I've refined it in my own understanding, which is pure autogynephile, which is a man who is sexually turned on by the fantasy of having female genitalia, vagina and breasts. So, and then there's another category, which is the child with rapid onset gender dysphoria, who all of a sudden comes home from school and says, I want to be non-binary or trans. So those are the different categories, but they're all called transgender. And the problem is, apart from the transvestites is the majority, the others are tiny. And so when you're talking about the Supreme Court judgment, where, I'm sorry, if you're biological male, you shouldn't be going to the women's toilets, the very small number of transsexuals probably aren't that fast, because they probably just go to the disabled toilets anyway. The ones who really get off on being in women's spaces are the fetishistic transvestites. So if you think about the unhelpful umbrella term transgender, 97% of trans-identifying females, as in people who want to be females, have a penis. So, they don't want to get rid of their penis. They just want to dress up as being a woman and get off on it. And they're the ones that are most annoyed about losing out on getting in these women's spaces. If you look on Twitter, there's always videos of, look, I'm in the ladies, look, and women don't get excited about going to the ladies. It's people who get off on getting in those spaces that now they feel robbed of that. I mean, if nobody cares about going to the disabled toilets, it's just call it disabled / unisex / whatever. It's just the third space. So just have a third space toilet they can go into. Problem solved.
And is it fair to say that somebody that thinks that they were born in the wrong body has a disability?
Well, you could say that. I mean, everything's a disability. I mean, my eyesight's probably a disability. So, yes, I mean, not all disabilities are visible. So they could have another disability that's not visible anyway.
So transvestites, we could possibly blame Tim Curry for that trend, couldn't we?
It was a good musical film.
It's super. It's actually one of my favourites.
I actually hate musicals. I only like Rocky Horror and Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah, the Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of my. I mean, Richard O'Brien, but we won't go down that route. But then you got the transgenders.
Yeah, the transgenders is the overall group.
Love the new look.
So you got transsexuals.
Transsexuals.
Transvestites.
Yeah.
Hi,
Autogynephiles.
Free Adventure.
So the
Thank you for being here.
autogynephiles, that's what I was thinking. In my head when you was telling me that, I'm thinking Tim Curry.
So AGP.
AGP. I'm also thinking, so the people with AGP that get sexually aroused by imagining
Having a vagina. Whilst masturbating
their penis.
Did anyone notice?
Yeah, we're going there, aren't we?
No, not yet. I just started. It takes a while for people to come in.
I dare say that there's been many a man that sat there with a stiff dick, imagining what it'd be like being a woman, and it arouses him to the point that he then goes and takes himself to get operated on, has his surgery, gets his dick and balls removed, wakes up, libido's gone, and is no longer sexually aroused by being a woman, and then buyer's remorse kicks in.
So if you imagine that you're a man and you spent years with the sole masturbatory fantasy of having a vagina, you have a 6-minute GP appointment in the UK NHS. It's probably a bit awkward to say, I've spent decades masturbating furiously thinking of having a vagina. You probably think, I think I should be a woman. And the GP says, okay, fine, you can go to Charing Cross Sex Change Clinic. There's a 2-year waiting list. And then you go, oh, well, I've got my money saved up. I'll just book myself in to have a neo vagina installed in Bangkok, and you fly there. And I had one patient who said, I'm not sure whether this is right, because obviously it doesn't make sense if you're masturbating furiously with your penis, imagining not having a penis. So he got there and he said to the surgeon, I'm not sure that I'm doing the right thing. And the surgeon in Bangkok said, I've booked the operating theatre now. And he said, okay, I'll have it done then, which isn't a good sign. and then he woke up and wished he hadn't had it done, because as soon as you get rid of your testicles, your libido goes, and you're going, shit, I've got a vagina. So yeah, so the ones I've seen come too late, and the ones that aren't too late, I put in my therapy group with all the people who were gender euphoric, wanting a sex change, all my post-operative regretters and detransitioners who regret doing it, and the transvestites, and by being in a group, they could all challenge each other, not just Smarty Pants me challenging them, but each other, and they could identify other people who had been just like they are now, but had come to regret it.
Yeah, that's a very clever way of doing it. So actually, when you go on podcasts like this, it's actually really important that you do this for people with AGP that haven't quite taken that
because I spent decades seeing people and treating them, but it was in this bubble and nobody knew what was happening. But at least now, even if I'm not doing it, I can help people understand it, because they're just fed this narrative of, you know, born in the wrong body, you need to have a sex change, reveal the real person that you are, everyone will accept you and you'll be happy ever after. But it's not the case, because 26% of the people that I saw were regretters. And they said, no one's followed us up, no one's asked us how we are. You know, every single medical intervention is followed up except gender reason.
So do you think more knowledge needs to be, but far more awareness needs to be had on the subject? Because it just seems like there would be an easy prevention to this madness if people catch it early enough. It's, let's give you some therapy before you go and get your dick chopped off.
Totally. And all my regretters said, you know, we wish that we had someone like you before we did this, because they said, you know, we came up with this idea that we were the wrong sex, but nobody said, because all my therapy was basically me asking, why are you sure, help me understand that, talk me through it. And by them talking me through it, they often saw how it didn't really make sense. And when they were being challenged, gently challenged by other people also with gender problems in the group, they could disentangle it and realise what it was, which was a false solution for other underlying problems. But they'd come to the conclusion that this was the solution, and they're very honed in, autistic, rigid, inflexible, this is right, I'm going to pursue it. But what they did say was that nobody ever asked them why and why do you want to do this? All they had were people affirming them. And, you know, affirming is called colluding. I don't...
Enabling.
Affirming sounds nice, doesn't it? Because it sounds so positive. But actually, you're just colluding with them. And, you know, if you said you're Napoleon, I'd go, yes, you're Napoleon. Yeah. That wouldn't be helpful. That's just me affirming you.
We need tough love on this one.
Exactly. So you just need people saying, hang on a minute. And so they said, all the regretters said, I went back to, you know, my family, my workplace, my friends, and I said, why didn't you just ask me what I was doing? And all the people, all the family, workforce and friends said, because we were being supportive. We were just, you know, so as soon as you get people who just affirm people, it's really unhelpful. You know, if you get this child who's confused, it's normal for children to be confused about, you know, who they are, what they are, and you know, if they say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be a boy, I shouldn't be a girl, because you're not sure about, you know, whatever. As soon as you get someone who says, oh yes, you're trapped in the wrong body, an adult who knows better, and your teachers and doctors, then they must be right. So you just go down this trajectory.
How do we get it out the education system?
You need to get out of the education system. It's awful. It's dire. It's not education. It's like teaching children that the earth is flat. You know, it's nonsense. And you know, children in this country leave school not being able to read or write, or not knowing where countries are in the world, or be able to do sums. But they're really clued up on how to have sex changes. The priority's all wrong.
And I don't think people are aware just how many kids are either transitioning or trying to transition or going home saying that they're a girl
but
when they're a boy.
Groomed into it. So, you know, I had a friend who their child was in the school, and in the registration every morning they had to say whether they were present, yes, and what pronouns they had that day, as if it were like, you know, why is that necessary? That was every morning at registration. I had another friend who their tomboy daughter was asked by the teacher whether she'd considered whether she should be a boy. And then I had another friend whose daughter, he came home and found this exercise book of her 8-year-old, and the 8-year-old had drawn lots of pictures of her being dead, saying, I'm not a proper girl because I like football. and she'd had some sort of gender ideology, brainwashing, and because she liked football and stuff, she'd be better off dead. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's not education. It's sort of,
It's child abuse.
it is child abuse. Yeah. And when you look at the, I worked for a time in the Tavistock Gids when I was training. When I say worked, I've never sanctioned hormones or surgery for anyone with gender problems. I've literally observed and sat there and caused trouble. I was the precursors of the whistleblowers in the Tavistock, and all I could see was young tomboys, girls, and slightly camp boys being brought in, often like 4 or 5 years old, with parents who had convinced themselves and the child that they were the wrong sex. I'm sorry, a 4-year-old does not know what it is to be male or female. But these parents had really bought into it, and they changed the child's name, they bought them wigs, and that is called Munchausen by proxy. Munchausen is when you invent illnesses in yourself. Munchausen by proxy is when you use your child to be ill. And there's nothing wrong with the kids. And I said to the person who set up ran the gender clinic, the child gender clinic at Tavistock, I said, what you're doing isn't this mad? Because if you just leave these kids alone, we know they're just going to grow up not having any gender. A lot of them will just be gay. And he said, would it be any more mad than if they were gay? Because the Tavistock in those days was...
What is the Tavistock?
So the Tavistock is the largest NHS psychotherapy clinic in the country. So it's on 4 floors, and when I was there 25 years ago, the Gids gender clinic was a tiny little boil in the whole institution. It was a few people in a broom cupboard. But since then, the trajectory of referrals meant that it became this massive cancer. So whereas the referrals for the normal adult psychotherapy, couple therapy, group therapy had dwindled down, the gender stuff had exploded. So most of their income was coming from that. So up until recently, it was a very well-known clinic with a good reputation for analytic psychotherapy, and it offered excellent training. But now it's just known for the child gender stuff. But psychoanalysis up until recently was very much along the lines of homosexuality is an inversion, which is a bit like a perversion, and it's pathological. So when I was there training, I had 2 terms of the pathology of homosexuality. So for this child gender clinic, if the child was to become gay, that would be a bad outcome. But if you can trans the child so that they're straight, but you now medically, chemically made them not the opposite sex, that was better because they were straight. Which is abhorrent, really. It's not very inclusive. It's quite homophobic.
And is there a link between homophobia and transgenderism?
Yeah, so if you look at the Middle East, it's if you're gay, you get thrown off the top of the building, or if you have a sex change, then that's okay because you're not gay anymore because you're now the opposite sex. So, in the Middle East, that's favoured. And, I had patients who early on from countries elsewhere in the world where, a mother would say to her son, look, we live in this country, there's no way you're going to grow up to be gay. You're going to have a sex change. So, Frog marched the son, age 16, had a sex change, and then spent the rest of their life as a trans woman and had nightmares about, sort of dead men in dreams because it wasn't their decision. So there's definitely a link. There's a lot of homophobia in transing. So there's a phrase, transing the gay away. There was a study which was unfortunately called the Sissy Boy study in 1977 by Professor Green, who was a forerunner of the Charing Cross Gender Clinic. And his study showed that if you get all the gender questioning boys who are unsure about their gender, if you leave them alone, they're all fine. They grow out of it. Hardly any of them persist with gender confusion. So there's absolutely no reason to intervene for children with gender questioning problems. And also with children, which I think is vile, is you're doing interventions on them that they have no capacity to give informed consent for. So if you're giving children these things called puberty blockers, which are actually chemical castrations. They're what you gave to Alan Turing in the war to chemically castrate him. We go to the cinema and go, isn't it awful how we treated gays in the war? But you're giving the same thing to your kids now. So when you chemically castrate them, 100% of them end up going on cross-sex hormones. Because if you're not sure whether you're a boy and you haven't had puberty yet, and then you don't have puberty because you've been chemically castrated, and all your peers are going through puberty, it sort of reinforces the fact that you're not a boy. And also, what people don't talk about is one of the side effects of going down the physical route is they may never have a sexual orgasm as an adult. And you can't. How can you, as a prepubescent teenager, give informed consent to the possibility of never having a sexual orgasm if you've never had one and don't know what it is? So it's all a bit dodgy, really. I mean, I think it's child abuse.
It clearly is to me from your description of it all. I've always wondered, when kids are given puberty blockers to transition, like actual children...
Castration agents.
Exactly that. I often wonder, well, how come the doctor's prescribing that? How come they're not going to jail? How come it's actually legal?
The interesting thing is that the the agents that they're using, the hormones and the hormone... So they're not licensed for gender dysphoria. They're licensed for precocious puberty, which is like puberty that's gone nuclear at too young, or, you know, other things, or for cancer, or for... They're not licensed for childhood gender dysphoria. And it's quite clever of the drug companies, because if, I'm not saying if, when we have a tsunami of legal cases, they can't sue the drug companies because the farmer will say, we didn't license it for that use. You're using it off license. So they're protected. It'll be the doctors who get it.
It's beyond sick. It's upsetting. It's disturbing. And I can't believe it's got this out of control.
But because it's referred to as treatment. So when...
It's all worded very, very nicely.
Very, very nicely. So, you know, giving people a bilateral mastectomy they don't need is called top surgery. It's very sanitised, you know, and bottom surgery, which is like castrating, physically castrating you and giving a hole there or whatever. So it's all sanitised. And, you know, and when the Cass review, which was brilliant, Hilary Cass is excellent. She did a very thorough evidence-based piece of work, and I was interviewed and helped alongside people I know. And you cannot critique the Cass review. It is much needed. All the people that are critiquing it don't really understand anything about evidence-based medicine. But they said that we should not be giving these drugs and castration agents to minors. Then there's all this backlash by, you know, Mermaid and other charities and Stonewall and parents saying, well, you're denying our children treatment. So, but they actually call it treatment. It's not treatment.
Nah.
It's, you know, it's a bit like a lobotomy. It was treatment, but it wasn't treatment.
Yeah, disgusting. In fact, shocking. And now that you put it in layman's terms like that they use words like treatment, it's like it's an act of kindness when actually you're torturing this soul for the rest of their life.
But what I find really odd is when you get parents championing for their child to be castrated.
Yeah,
I mean, that's so odd.
Yeah, that's bizarre. So they're getting the attention, like you say, by proxy.
Yeah, but why would you do that to your child?
Yeah, these are the kind of parents that shouldn't be allowed to have children.
Well,
that's another
problem is anyone can have children.
Controversial point of view, that is. What's the most common reason for transitioning?
So with the biological males, 100% of them autistic. When you're autistic, very black and white. And if you're autistic, there are things that are a bit different about you. You might be a bit nerdy. You might not be very good at sort of, building friendships. You're more likely to play computer games on your own and not leave the house. A bit of a generalisation there. So you might grow up understandably thinking, I'm a bit different to everyone else. And you might then go on this bit of a search mission of, why am I not like everyone else? And you may not come to the conclusion that you're on the spectrum, but for some of these people, the idea is planted into their head that maybe they're the wrong sex. So not every male with autism decides that they're the wrong sex, but a small proportion will get the idea, and then they run with it. And before they run with it, if you sort of get them there and try and help think about it, then that's even easier. But once they get an idea into their head, they get really fixed on it. And If you don't collude with them and agree with them, then you're against them. So the autistic mind is very black and white. Yes, no, male, female, right or wrong. So I always liken it to my my maths A level, which was disastrous, in that if you do sequential processing of a problem, if you take one step wrong, you'll end up in a completely wrong place. So what I would do with these patients is say, rather than, oh, yes, you are, oh, no, you're not, which is the danger of becoming, is say, well, okay, I can't get my head around how you got there. So please, could you just show me the working through, like a primary school teacher does. You know, show me how you got from knowing that you're a boy to thinking that you should be a girl. And they take you through the stepwise thing. And sometimes the adults haven't revisited their working through since they came to that faulty conclusion as a child. But then asking to revisit it and show you how they got there, it's apparent as to how they went a bit off-piste. And that's even better in a group.
That's genius.
So that's the males. The females, transsexuals, yes, some of them are autistic, but then some of them aren't. And what you see is a higher proportion of victims of abuse, internalized misogyny, internalized lesbophobia. And on that thing, I mean, when I see biological girls who are like 17 who are convinced that they should be a boy, and I say, okay, but at the moment, irrespective of what you can be, at the moment you're a girl and you said that you fancy girls, so aren't you just a lesbian? They go, no, not lesbian. And I say, do you know any lesbians? No. Do you know any famous lesbians? No. Do you know any trans masculine people? They go, oh, yeah. So, you know, the children's world is full of influences of if you're a girl who fancies girls, would you want to be like a boring lesbian thing? What's that? Or I could be a big, muscly, trans masculine. So it's more exciting for them to be that. I said to Hilary Cass when I was and she said, well, what about Sandy Toksvig? And I said, no girl's going to want to grow up to be Sandy Toksvig, are they? But yeah, they need more lesbian role models. Otherwise, you're getting lesbian erasure. If you look at the BBC, look at children's programmes. There's all these. Yes, the BBC, awful BBC. There's all these programmes for children about sort of, you know, having a sex change, and isn't it wonderful? And, you know, various, you know, my tea diaries, whatever it is. I don't know whether that's BBC or not, but, you know, it's always a happy ever after story.
This is kind of off the professional route, more of an opinion, but you must have thought about it. Why are the BBC pushing transgenderism?
Well, the BBC push lots of narratives that aren't reality, but they piggyback on the idea that some people still think that they're an objective, neutral broadcaster. And I'm shocked that people still think that, but they're so not. If you look at their political coverage of various things or how they depict certain, it's not neutral at all. So, you know, I'm not surprised that they also are not neutral about this. You know, how many times have they chosen an average housewife to talk about something, but actually a trans person at the washing up sink with a. There was one person they interviewed that had a neovaginal dilator on the draining board. I mean, that was the average woman. They were talking about some random thing, but they have to get their sort of, you know, their diverse, inclusive money's worth somewhere.
Richard Herron, you suggested that I read that story, and I didn't have the time, and I thought, well, actually, I'll ask you because you'll be able to paint a much better picture than me. It's a harrowing story. You warned me.
Richie's great, and he has done so much to raise awareness of just how awful, horrific, and barbaric this child mutilation service is. So Richie was someone who had a number of mental health problems. He's very open about it. He's written a chapter in my book, so I'm not disclosing anything here. It is a harrowing chapter in the book. And he talks about how he had various problems with his mental health and OCD and various things. But amongst that, he had this idea at some point that maybe he should be a girl. And once he said that, he was put on this conveyor belt trajectory, even when he was uncertain and not sure. And then before you know, he had hormones. Before you know, he was offered a sex change. And not long after, realised that it was a big mistake. And, you know, he's in his 20s and he's got a lifelong of having a body that he knows was a mistake. And it's just awful. And the amount of medical complications he had is horrific, ongoing still.
Infections.
And everything, he's had everything. And, you know, these are childhood experiments. And, you know, specialists in all these fields don't really know how to deal with all these complications because it's a man-made problem. And have you heard of WPATH?
No.
So WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They are the worldwide standard-setting committee for how to treat trans, and they publish the standards of care, which started off with the Harry Benjamin criteria very early on, which basically said, before you have a sex change, you've got to live in the opposite sex role, cross-dress for a certain amount of time, and then only after 2 years have surgery. That was the simple guidelines. They've expanded, and last year, exactly a year ago, they came up with version 8 of their standards of care. And in addition to transsexuals, they have a new diagnostic category called eunuch gender. And what they say eunuch gender are boys who identify as eunuchs, and the recommended treatment by WPATH is to have a physical castration, and they say that there's no lower age limit. So you could do this at 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is a bit baffling. So if you look at their references for how they came to that conclusion, if you look at and normally references are studies and things, whatever. Their references are the eunuch gender archives. The eunuch gender archives are not clinical studies. They're not written by doctors. The eunuch gender archives is written pornography depicting the forced castration of boys.
How the fuck did we get here?
You know, in medicine, in surgery, we always have guidelines that are written based on evidence base by a group of experts. WPATH sounds like it's a group of experts, but actually it's a pro-trans ideological group of people. But the world unquestioningly presumes it's all evidence-based. There's no evidence base for eunuch gender. The evidence is written pornography. So we're not looking at evidence-based, we're looking at feelings-based or ideological belief. And that's what the world's going at. And it's fooled the whole world. So, you know, all the medical colleges go by this, and medicine's been hoodwinked, you know, into believing that. I teach medical students, and some of them feel they're not even allowed to consider people as male or female. They have to just, you know, whatever the patient identifies with. So they're trading in biology and science for, you know, emotionally felt reality in a post-truth age.
And what is gender neutrality? People that identify as gender neutral?
Oh, non-binary?
Yeah.
Oh, so what in the book, there's a must-read book, or at least must-buy book. In what I've said
Buy
is
shelf.
buy and read it. Honestly, if you buy that book and read the book, if you ever get into a discussion or an argument around a dinner party about trans stuff, and you've read my book, you'll win. Because, you know.
I know the gender neutral question sounds very simple, but I think...
I've gone off track.
Well, no, it's just a lot of people hear that term, but I actually wonder how many people fully understand it.
So when I talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria, that's when you've got, like, you know, Harry's fine, and then he comes home from school and goes, oh, actually, I want to be non-binary. They're just goths. So, like, I used to be a goth, sort of. And
These are the subcultures.
yeah. So we've always had subcultures. And the whole point of post-war, post-Second World War, we've always had subcultures. And the point of a subculture is in between transitioning from being a child who understands the world as your parents told you it is, to being an adult where you've worked out what the world is. There's this in-between stage where you're fighting back, questioning, being subversive, and historically that was always bound up with music. So you had like hippies, mods, rockers, punks, and I was a post-punk goth. I was goth Mark 1. In the book I go through the face of goth. But most of those subcultures, if you look at what they look like, they weren't particularly masculine or feminine. You know, hippies were long-haired men, and, you know, punks and Mark 1 goths we didn't look particularly masculine and feminine. We probably at best looked like dodgy transvestites, but it was not about...
Rock stars with eyeliner.
Exactly.
Long hair.
I had more makeup than most girls do these days. It was more than it was decent to have.
Iggy Pop with his belly out.
He didn't have a belly ever, did he?
Well, his waist exposed.
Yeah. So, you know, I started medical school with like vertical purple hair and lots of makeup.
You didn't.
I did, but luckily UCL was very accommodating. But, you know, we all looked like dodgy transvestites. And the new romantics, you know, like Boy George and Steve Strange, they weren't pretending to be the opposite sex. They were just subverting normal boundaries, you know. So, and then you get social media. And when social media arrived, subversive youth, you know, it was all about your Facebook profiles, your MySpace profiles, your whatever it is, social media profiles. Music was just this other thing. So the medium of went from music to your social media profile. So kids now, yeah, they like music, but they don't cover their walls and stuff. And you know, they weren't as obsessed with music as we were. So now it's on their social media. So because subcultures haven't stopped, but because it's not music based, we don't think of them as subcultures. So I always use this example. And thank you, Jenny, for allowing me to. So when I went to school one day, Jenny turned up, massive backcombed hair, eyeliner, lipstick. We were going, oh my God, you're so cool, what are you, I'm a goth. Within 2 weeks, epidemic of goths in this North Wales public school. And, you know, we hadn't caught it like COVID, it was an epidemic. It was just a cool thing to do. So when now somebody like Jenny turns up and they go, what are you, I'm trans non-binary, all the kids become trans. They haven't caught it. They're not really, it's just Goth Mark 5. You know, Goth Mark 4 was emo. Goth Mark 5 is non-binary trans. So, you know, when your kid says, oh, I'm suddenly think I'm the opposite sex, they're just being a bit goth.
Is this why the trans community hate you? Because you see it as a bit of a phase?
Well, I break it down for different subtypes, so they're not all the same. But I know them for what they are. You know, you've got the transsexuals, the male ones, females, different reasons why they might be there. The transvestites. In my book, I describe 11 different subtypes of transvestite. You've got the ADPs, and you've got the kids who are just basically goth. You know, and the transvestites, the 11 different subtypes, literally can be about getting turned on by being in a woman's space, getting turned on by knowing that you're a man wearing women's clothing and some sort of taboo you're breaking. I had a patient who would go out looking like literally a bad tranny and would walk around playgrounds and stuff outside, getting jeered, but he was a sadomasochist. He was a masochist, and he wanted to be humiliated, so he did it on purpose. And you get men who don't feel very confident being men because they they don't, and they go out looking like a bad tranny, and you get people jeering, "Oh, you're a man," and that reinforces their sense, "Oh, I'm a man." You get people who get turned on by the texture of the fabric against the skin. So there's lots of different types of transvestite. There's always been loads of them. You know, remember the Beaumont Society and all those sort of, middle-aged men secretly going and cross-dressing. They're not transsexual. But you don't hear anyone talking about transvestites anymore. They're all just trans. And we presume falsely that everyone who's trans must be a transsexual. They're not. They're mainly transvestites, getting turned on by cross-dressing.
Being gay and being transgender, that sounds complicated, but I'm sure that's out there.
No, there's not an over representation of gays in transgender, because if you think about it, with autism, the more autistic you are, the less interested in sex you are. So the really autistic ones think sex is icky, don't get interested, or they have no interest in sex. So they have sex, they can get physically turned on, but they don't have the emotional, erotic thing. It's like being colourblind. How do you know you're colourblind? You don't know what colour is. So they might not know that they're asexual, so they can still have sex, and they can. So it's more of an anti-gay thing, the trans thing, because if anything, they're trying to escape from some of them, all of them, from being gay. So there's not a link. But the link that does exist is Stonewall used to represent gay people, basically. Then they got gay marriage accepted, and then they thought, well, there's nothing to fight for. So they had a meeting, and they said, we can either pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done, disband, or we've got loads of money and funding, let's just carry on with a new cause. So half of them said, let's just promote transgender ideology. Half of them said, no, that's not what we were meant to be doing. They left and formed the LGBT Alliance, and Stonewall just became about trans. So that's one link, because gay people still think that Stonewall is for them, but they don't realise it's not for them. And the other link is that drag queens, which had nothing to do with this, drag queens, you know, go to gay bars and things, and they're all funny and perform and whatever it is. Gay people often don't know the difference between a drag queen, a transvestite, and transsexual. They think, oh, they're fun, yes, we like them. The thing about drag queen is that whilst the transsexual and the transvestite believe that in these gender rules that they must adhere to, the drag queen's more complex than that, because they know how ridiculous it is. And the drag queen looks ridiculous on purpose. And unlike what most people think, it's not a parody of women. It's a parody or a piss take of the gender framework. They're saying, look, if you think having long hair, makeup and a dress and high heels is feminine, do you think I look feminine? So it's not look how ridiculous a woman is, it's look how ridiculous your notions of gender are. So the drag queen is actually quite an advanced thing, and it's not being a slave to the rules. So I don't have a problem with drag. Drag story hour for children is a bit weird and not very appropriate, I don't think. But drag is a performance. It's not a lifestyle.
And what's the queer theory?
Queer theory was never meant to be taken seriously. So when I did my master's in group analysis, and I applied it to trans, I made myself read every single book at that time written by Judith Butler. Judith Butler is one of the forerunners of queer theory, and she's the most difficult person to read. Sometimes one sentence will last 3 pages, and you get the idea that she's just trying to look clever, because I've always believed that if you are clever, you communicate in a way that people understand. If you go out of your way to communicate in a way that nobody understands, then, you know, that says something more about the author than and not about their intellect. But the whole point of queer theory is it's an academic way of subverting normal framework. So you think this is this, what if it isn't this? You know, what if sex isn't this? What if gender isn't this? What if sex? So it's just an academic posturing exercise
The
of
devil's advocate exercise.
dismantling, disrupting. And it's not meant to be a rule for living. Whereas if you're a bit autistic, you might confuse it for a rule for living. So the thing about Judith Butler, she seemed to change her mind in every book. So when you get to one of her books called Gender Trouble, I actually didn't have a problem with that. I think it's actually a very good book. And it talks about how gender is a social construct. It's this thing that if you have a society where there's this notion of femininity, which is having, like, you know, lipstick and heels, if that's repeated over time, then people believe that is what femininity is. Whereas actually it's just the society that's brought into it. Whereas another society might have like a lip plate or metal rings on your neck. But then her next book, Bodies That Matter, she completely turns that on its head. So by the very essence of queer theory, she disrupts and subverts her own thinking sequentially. So it's a introspective, navel-gazing academic exercise of dismantling and disrupting. It is by no means a rule for... But you know, if you make it as a rule for living, that's not queer theory. That's just turning it into rules. The whole point of queer theory is there's no rules, but it's not meant to be lived. You know, instructions for living. It's just an academic exercise.
And what about the overvalued idea concept?
So overvalued idea is a psychiatric term, and if you get people who believe something that's not true, if they're absolutely convinced that it is true, that it's a delusion, it's a fixed false belief. If they're amenable to thinking, well, maybe, you know, I think it's true, but maybe it's not, then it's a delusion light, which is an overvalued idea. So the anorexic who really thinks they should probably get thinner and thinks, oh, maybe I'm fat, they don't believe they are, because they did it to be a delusion. They're really invested in the idea. So the transsexual who really thinks that they should be the opposite sex, really invested into this idea. They don't believe they're the opposite sex. If they were, they wouldn't need to have any surgery or hormones or anything. But they buy into the idea a lot, so that's why it's no valid idea. Because initially, in my early papers, I was questioning is the transsexual mad? Are they psychotic? Are they delusional? And I answered it by saying, no, they're not. They have overvalued ideas into this false solution. But there is madness. The madness is in us around them. So if you think of them in a system of people, them in a group of people, society, yes, there's madness, but the madness isn't located in the transsexual. The madness is located in the people around them, like the Emperor's new clothes. Everyone's saying, yes, the Emperor's wearing this amazing outfit, but actually he's naked. So we're mad, not them. They are probably autistic. They've come to the wrong conclusion. They're investing in a false solution, but we're mad in how we respond around them.
I asked this question to the trans man that was on, and I said to him, do you think that a trans man has the right to be a mother? And then I had to explain a bit further what I meant, because we've ascertained that somebody that thinks they're in the wrong body, they're quite unwell. So the real question was, if you know you're that unwell, should you be bringing a child into the world, into your environment that you know is dysfunctional? At what point do you think, I know I'm not well, as much as I'd like a baby, is it fair on the baby? Because then that baby has to grow up in my environment, which is not particularly healthy.
I think what's really disturbing is when you see videos of biological men who have transitioned in some way or other, going through the motions of breastfeeding a newborn infant. That's really difficult to watch, because either they're not producing any milk and you've got this starving baby that's really trying to feed and suckling on this nipple that's not giving any food, or these days you can come up with very sort of synthetic, highly chemical, hormone-ridden stuff that can come out of a male breast. Do you really want to give that to an infant? And
What is going on?
looks like
What's up,
to most
RC?
people is, this isn't for the baby's benefit, this is for your benefit. This is to validate your sense of being a woman. And again, I'd say getting a hungry newborn baby suckling on a breast that doesn't produce milk, I can't help but think it's child abuse.
I'm of exactly the same opinion.
You listening to a podcast?
Yeah.
We talk about the full process of transition, and not to be gratuitous, but just to give people that are watching, that are considering transitioning, or
A
people
step-by-step guide.
Step-by-step guide.
Are they going to try it themselves, though? Don't try this at home.
No, don't try this at home, kids. But you can make it as graphic as you can, because after that, we'll talk about buyer's remorse.
Do you
and,
agree with their
the people that
opinions
have
or
come
just
to you.
listening?
Sold.
Yeah, so talk me through.
No, I agree with their
You
opinion.
want to get a vagina fitted.
The doctor.
So the first thing is you take your balls out of your scrotum and you discard the balls. You keep the scrotum. And then if you think of your penis as like a three-rod structure, like all great architectural towers, the three rods gives it stability. So what you want to do is you cut the bit that fills up with blood that makes it go red, you cut that off, and you're left with some spindly, fleshy bit.
So this particular doctor read all the queer theory books in order to write his counter,
this spindly thing. Then you
his
cut
counter
off
book.
the fleshy penis to a stump.
So
Small stump,
he
'cause that's
you
gonna be
know,
the clitoris.
he knows what he's talking about.
And then you make a hole, a bit like an apple corer, in the space between where your scrotum was and where your rectum is. So that's sort of like, brownfield site for development.
OALR.
You have a hole there, and then you make the hole preferably the size of a penis that I want to put it in, and then you line it with the skin of the penis. So that's the vagina. So your near vagina lining will be the skin lining of your penis, and then the scrotal sac, a bit looks like chicken skin, that is then fashioned into the labia. Yeah. So you've got your labia are the scrotal skin. The near vagina is the inverted penis skin, and at the end of it, you've got this stump left of the penis, which will be your clitoris. There's no guarantee that you'll have any sensation or orgasm actually. You may not. The complications are that it won't have the same textural feel, responsivity, or it's probably a bit like vegan meat, where it might look the same, but it's not really the same.
Hasn't quite got the same kick as a fillet steak.
Yeah, I read this wonderful.
It's
post
hard, dude.
yesterday
This
on
this
Twitter
mission
where
keeps
someone
kicking
said,
my ass.
this person was speaking as a man from experience who's tried both versions, and he said it's not the same. It's not the same as the. And the other problem is that depending how much you've depilated, got rid of the hair, plucked the hair from your scrotum, electrolysis, you might get some hairy bits in the wrong places. The other thing is that for these kids who are having chemical castrations, they don't go through puberty. If you don't go through puberty, you don't have a very big penis. So you have a small penis. And the length of your neovagina is the length of your penis. Because you're turning
Bit of an
inside.
odd podcast.
So if you don't...
Well, it's a suppressed podcast.
He doesn't have a very big penis.
Because
got a
everybody
very
running
small
YouTube is in Silicon Valley.
To make it
So,
longer, they might
when
cut a bit of your
doctors,
gut out.
academics, and scientists come out
And
talk about
So you might
things
have
that the
an
woke
inside-out
crowd
penis
disagrees, it gets suppressed.
or you
This
might have a
podcast barely
bit
have
of
any
your
views.
colon as a lining of
And
your
he's like a well-decorated doctor, too.
So either way, it's not great. Not the same thing. They might look, impressive from the outside. On closer inspection, it's not going to be quite the same thing. And there's various sort of, infections and various things. And if you've got too much of a stump left, it might be
What's his
bulging
name?
out,
His name
and then you've got
is
to dilate it every
Dr.
day,
Az
for a period of time to make sure
Hakim.
it doesn't close in on itself and heal up. It's basically a
Dr.
wound.
I was going to say your
Az
body's natural reaction
Hakim.
is to heal the wound.
Yeah. So you've got to put this metal dilator in it to stop it from healing up every day for ages. So it's, like with all plastic surgery, it's phenomenally clever. My first job as a doctor was in plastics, not being a clever surgeon, but being a very junior house officer. And seeing what they could do was phenomenal. It's amazing, but you can't make a man into a woman. You can make things, in plastic surgery, you can be very good at making things look like things. I had someone who had a massive tumour around their eye socket, so they had all this removed. So they got a piece of pelvis there. They recreated a flap of skin around the eyelid. For the moist bit of the eyelid, they got a bit of inside your lip because it's moist, and so they were very clever in resourcefully recreating and reconstructing things to look as much as possible like it's meant to look. So they're very clever at making men's bodies refashioned to look as much as it's meant to look like a female's body, but it's not the same.
And what about the transition, the process from a woman to a man?
Well, that's worse.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How could it possibly be worse?
So you've got two options. Well, you've got three options. You either don't do anything and just be a man with a vagina, if that's possible, or you have a lot of testosterone that makes your clitoris into what's called a mega clitoris, which is basically an oversized clitoris, like a, and then that functions as a tiny micro penis, and some people are happy with that. Or you get abdominal fat, and I could harvest quite a lot of fake penises with my abdominal fat, which hopefully you're not showing. But you get a tube of abdomen, and you sew it up in a tube, and then you basically remove it and stick it down there. So you have this this piece of flesh covered in skin that dangles down there. It doesn't really look like a penis.
Oh, if those surgical procedures sound horrific, irreversible, depressing. But then again, I'm of sound mind and I'm very happy being a man. But you say 26% of your patients come to you with buyer's remorse.
Yeah, and this isn't 26% of all people who've had the surgery, because there were a skewed sample. There were people wanting to see a specialist in gender identity psychotherapy, so it's a very different population. We don't know how many people regret, and there's lots of untruths in the whole trans thing, like you can change sex, or like you're born in the wrong body, or that everyone's happy. Another one that they make up is that there's a 1% regret rate. That is completely false. You'll hear people quote that all the time. There are no outcome studies. This 1% is made up. There's no outcome studies. All my regretters say that they were never followed up. They were never a piece of data. They're invisible data. So nobody knows
Have
how
a
many
good
regressors
one.
there are.
See you
So
later,
the 1%
Artsy.
is complete bunkum.
What kind of a state are they when they come
Ema,
to you
head off
with,
to bed.
with regret?
Hey,
Make
thank
it
you.
as-
Hey, tomorrow there's a
not
new
just as
game
real as
coming
it
out,
is.
and I'm gonna check it
they're-
out. You should
Suicidal?
check it out too.
So
Are you
they're
on Steam
in
PC?
a state of mourning for the loss of their life as they knew it, and it's similar to doing bereavement work.
I use
only
Xbox
rather
Series
than
S.
Oh, okay.
coming
Then
to terms with a death and then moving on.
I
with
don't think
life.
it's on
They're-
Xbox.
they're
Anyway, in
almost
case that
living
it
with
is,
death
the game is
every
called
day, because
Where Winds
obviously they
Meet,
haven't died,
and it's
but
a
them as they knew
big
it
game,
died,
and it
and
looks
they're living
beautiful and
in a
action
body
packed.
that
I'm gonna
they
be
feel
checking
is a
it out
fraud.
tomorrow.
And what they started off with was a sense of inauthenticity about their self,
Right.
which they believed was to do with their gender. So they have
ALR.
gender dysphoria, and then they have this excited idea that they could become like a Bond girl or something, and then they have this gender euphoria when they were pursuing this. Then they transitioned. They may have had a period of transgender euphoria. Woohoo! I'm this woman. And then after a certain period of time, and my patient said there was a peak at 7 years. I don't know where they got that from. They repeatedly said that. There was this sense of, oh, maybe I'm not the woman that I thought everyone thought I was.
7-year itch, they've fallen out of love with themselves.
Yes, and that's when you got the transgender dysphoria, and they end up with the same sense of feeling inauthentic about themselves, their gender.
They
that
go right
start
back
off-
to the start.
Yeah, yeah. And what determines whether or not they do or not is how autistic they are.
Oh, it's very sad.
So if you're really autistic and you honestly think that everyone says what they think, and everyone's calling you she and her and yes, and they really do think you're a woman, then you're probably fine. The less autistic, the ones with all able to do some critical thinking, they're the ones that are most at risk of regretting, because they see, maybe I'm not really the woman maybe people don't really see me as a woman. They're patronising me.
Yeah. So what is the difference between body dysmorphia and body dysphoria?
There's no such thing as body dysphoria. It's just,
What's it supposed to mean then? Because I hear them terms all the time. and I-
so dysmorphia, body is just you're not happy with your body. So it could be anything. It could be that you feel you're too fat, you're too thin, you don't like your nose. So it just means you're not happy with some aspect of your body. So if you've got body dysmorphia or dysphoria, the same thing.
oh, okay. So they mean the same thing.
Same thing, yeah. You're basically looking in the mirror a lot of times at this piece of your body you don't like. So, for example, if you don't like your nose and you consider you don't like your nose for years on end, but has never changed focus, that's fine. You get your nose done, it's fine. That's a good prognosis. So I've got nothing against aesthetic surgery at all whatsoever. What I do have is people, because there's a difference between changing, refining, and whatever it is, tweaking, between trying to change yourself into something which categorically you're not. You know, so I'm not really a fan of people being made to look like cats or snakes or things. But I have no problem with people changing their nose or their ears or their breast or whatever it is. They're not purporting to be a different, species or sex.
People like Sam Smith, Jeffrey Marsh. I know they do two different things, but they're still influencing degeneracy. How can we put a stop to that madness?
But they're very different. Jeffrey Mark, the creepy guy on Twitter that tells children to follow him.
So are you familiar with him?
I've seen his. I mean, they're creepy as anything.
Yeah. So he's on TikTok.
He's got that sort of that sort of sneering, sort of creepy, and the fact that he's telling children to disown their parents and come.
Yes, that's him.
Come and talk to him. There's something a bit creepy about that.
It's very predatory,
Yeah.
and he's even managed.
Why is he so invested in it?
Well, I don't understand how he'll tell the parents videos. Now pass the phone to your child, and then he starts talking to their child in front of them about ignoring them if they say that they are in the wrong body.
But irrespective of him or whoever, all these things on social media, training children to disown their families and their parents, and mermaids used to have this red button thing where if your parent comes into the room, hit this red button, the screen will disappear. I mean, why would you encourage children to look at things that you're not happy their parents seeing? It's a bit like the schools who wouldn't show the parents the the indoctrination, gender ideology teaching. Why wouldn't they show the parents? As soon as anyone isn't happy to show parents what they're teaching your children, that's a red flag.
Because if you criticise trans ideologies on social media, your video gets pulled pretty quick, particularly on TikTok. But if you're the pro-trans ideology, it stays and you get to speak to parents and their children and indoctrinate them.
But we don't have free speech anymore, do we? So if we criticise certain things on social media, you just end up in prison. So you can't do that anymore.
Cool, we could go down a completely different avenue. Final question then. What would you say to any parent watching or listening that has a child that thinks they've been born in the wrong body?
So don't think that you have to collude with them and affirm them. That is the worst thing you can do. And rather than getting into a yes you are, no you're not, adopt a really, well that's quite a big thing and I can't get my head around it. So can you help me understand how you came to that conclusion? So get them to experience you as an ally, someone who loves them and cares about them and really wants to understand how they got there, because you really want to understand and help them. And read my book, because it'll be a lot more helpful. And also join a parent support group. So in the UK there's Bayswater, various countries have different parental support groups, because if you're a parent with a child who is saying that they're trans, it's really difficult for the parent. But if you're in a parental support group for other parents in a similar situation, it's a slightly bit easier, even though it's still difficult.
And where can people find you?
Just Google me.
You got an X account?
Doctor _as_, I think.
And where can people buy your book? Amazon?
Amazon, yeah.
Cool. Well, it's been fascinating and quite sad to hear your expert analysis on the whole.
Well, it is worrying, isn't it? It's a bit.
It is worrying, and I'm really grateful you come on to share that, because it's becoming more and more normalised. It's being spoke about all the time. The amount of people that
Normalised child abuse.
Exactly that. And I mean,
State-sanctioned child abuse.
men of our age, we have to do our little bit. We all do a little bit to keep the children safe. Then we can go to sleep at night. And I feel like today that we have. So
And the other thing is, if you have a child that is looking for a therapist to help them, make sure they are not an affirmatory therapist, because they'll just be grooming your child. Check with the therapist. Are you going to affirm my child's new gender ideas, or are you going to question them and critique them and challenge them? Because most therapists will be too scared to do that. They're better off having no therapy than having an affirmative therapist, because that's just grooming.
As it's been a joy, it's been fascinating. Thank you, brother.
Thank you for having me.
Good health. Cheers, mate.
We never encouraged patients to transition. We said, if you want to pursue the idea of transitioning, this is what you have to do. We never said you should transition.
My feeling is that they were dictated to, because they did everything that WPATH demanded. And if you look at the ICD, the World Health Organization's classifications, the trans activist group WPATH and another trans activist group, they came up with gender incongruence, and they came up with the idea to move this out of mental disorders, and they even came up with the idea to create a whole new section just for gender incongruence, so that it could be a disorder of sexual health. You can see them doing it in their meetings and in their papers, and then these big organizations, the APA and the World Health Organization, just do exactly what they're told. You can see it.
You're not going to have decent research on gender identity disorders for another 10 or 20 years, because it basically comes out of academia. Those are the people with the stat skills and the knowledge of how to do it, and it's a toxic topic. There are some heroic individuals like Mike Bailey and his students who do continue to do research in this area, but majority of universities, nobody's going to touch it, because nobody wants a lot of trans activists floating their deans or whatever and trying to get them fired.
Welcome, Dr. Ray Blanchard, to the podcast.
It's happy to be here.
Now, it's hard for me to imagine that there are still some people out there who don't know who you are and don't know what autogynephilia is, but there are such innocents in the world. So could you begin by briefly introducing yourself and what is autogynephilia?
Okay, briefly introducing myself. My name is Ray Blanchard. I worked for 15 years in a gender identity clinic from 1980 to 1995, and then I switched my focus to a assessment clinic for the assessment of sex offenders. During the years when I was working in gender, I published a lot of papers to do with gender identity disorders, and I think that's what people, for example, online know me as now with regard to the gender identity disorder papers, although actually, from my perspective, I wrote them a lifetime ago. In those papers, I identified something I called autogynephilia. It would scoop in what used to be called transvestism, but I recognized that the label transvestism was misleading and far too narrow. So I defined autogynephilia as a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought or image of himself as a female. And I also hypothesized, well, I think it's more than a hypothesis, I also stated that this was one of the two main pathways to transsexualism in male to female transsexuals.
Interesting. So that was 1989. Am I correct? You outlined autogynephilia?
That was the year in which I gave it the name autogynephilia, yeah. I had been circling around the concept, but it was in 1989 that I finally found a word that I thought described it.
So prior to that time, my understanding is everyone knew there were two groups, and everyone knew one group of men were heterosexual, and everybody knew that there was some sort of erotic motivation. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, everyone knew that there were at least two groups. Some other authorities had posited 3 groups or 4 groups or 5 groups. I did a bunch of formal studies and concluded that really it boiled down to 2 basically different groups, with what other researchers had identified as separate groups just being subtypes.
And one group was homosexual, the other heterosexual. The homosexuals, I was reading Anne Lawrence's Men Trapped in Men's Bodies just recently, and in that book she suggests that the homosexual transsexuals, there's no erotic motivation. It's strictly just wanting to blend in or internalized homophobia. Do you agree with that?
I agree that it's not primarily erotically motivated. I think that these are individuals who feel like the opposite sex from early childhood, and whereas a lot of cross-gendered children normalize in gender identity around puberty, these individuals don't normalize in gender identity around puberty, and they carry forward that cross-gender feelings and aspirations into adulthood. But I don't think, as some people have alleged, that they transition in order to sleep with straight guys. I don't believe that. I mean, I think that's maybe a benefit or an aspiration, but I don't think that that's their primary motivation.
Could I ask, I've met a few gay men, detrans, also remaining trans, who say that they were autogynephilic or are, and they're also gay. What is your position on that? Like, people say a lot of things. People say more than their prayers, as my mother used to say. But I have been told specifically by individuals that they are autogynephilic and gay. What's your take on all that?
In the years that I was interviewing patients, which was 1980 to 1995, I interviewed one biological male patient that I thought was genuinely homosexual and genuinely autogynephilic. Just the one. And I interviewed the hell out of him because, I didn't like the idea of these two types overlapping. But as far as I can see, this one patient was really, really homosexual in the way other patients were homosexual, and was really autogynephilic in the way other patients were really autogynephilic. But that's one patient out of many that I interviewed. And so I tend to be suspicious of people who say, who are like online, oh no, I'm a snowflake and I don't fit into these categories, and I have some of this and I have some of that, and I'm an original. So I tend to be a little skeptical of that.
Could you explain how you came to the realization that, because I think was before it was mostly people just thought these men were transvestites. They were turned on by wearing women's clothes, and some just wanted to do that full time and get hormones and surgeries. Like, how did you come to separate transvestites from autogynephilia?
Prior to the time that I invented the word autogynephilia, clinicians were aware that the people they were calling transvestites were not simply cross-dressing and masturbating. Clinicians were well aware that there was a mental content that accompanied periods of cross-dressing and sexual excitement, and that this mental content involved thoughts of being like a female or aspirations of being like a female. But they never bothered to change the word transvestite. And when I say other clinicians were aware of the mental content, even Magnus Hirschfeld himself, the man who invented the word transvestite, commented in print that the word transvestite merely referred to the most observable symptom, but it did not capture the essence of what the experience was like. So when I was working in this area, I decided, why not bite the bullet and invent a new word that actually focuses people on the essence of this syndrome, which is the mental content of feeling like a female, perceiving oneself as a female, and just indicate that cross-dressing is a conspicuous, striking symptom of this, but is not the essence or the defining characteristic of the syndrome. That was how it came about.
And can you explain how you did it? You developed an ingenious test.
I had a lot of questionnaire materials that I had developed when I first started working at the clinic, and I asked all kinds of questions I just asked every question that I could think of. I didn't have the concept of autogynephilia in mind, so there was no way I could tailor those questionnaire materials to autogynephilia. Just luckily, in my obsessional listing of every question I could think of, there were some that I could put together as a kind of scale for autogynephilia. So that helped me. But in fact, I guess my main breakthrough came when I interviewed a patient who never cross-dressed at all, but just had sexual fantasies in which he pictured himself as a new female. And he was also gender dysphoric. Not the most gender dysphoric I've ever seen, but gender dysphoric enough to be unhappy and present at a clinic. So seeing that patient where there's no cross-dressing made me realize, no, there really has to be another word for this. And that patient kind of tipped me over the edge where I thought, I've got to find a word. But it wasn't the questionnaires per se. I returned to the questionnaires once I had this, well, calling it insight sounds congratulatory, but once I had this thought that, no, I really have to invent another word, although I didn't really want to.
And did you measure arousal with penis gauges or pressure gauges or something?
Not in most of these patients. I published one paper in which I did phallometric testing of patients who denied that they were erotically aroused by cross-dressing and showed that there was, in fact, some detectable penile arousal. But that was just one study. It wasn't central to my concept of autogynephilia. It was addressed more, what are we to do with people who look like autogynephiles in every regard, but say that they have zero response to cross-gender ideation.
And how much resistance was there when you published your paper in 1989? Because people have extraordinary reactions to autogynephilia today. What was the response back then?
It was zip. Nobody read them.
That's what I thought.
I think that those papers would have been totally, just more trivial academic papers that get zero citations ever, except that two people discovered them and promoted them for me. One was Ann Lawrence and one was Mike Bailey. Both of them read these papers and really liked them, and they started writing about them. But I had and have never had really any capacity for promoting my work or myself. So if people hadn't come along and promoted those papers for me, nobody would ever have heard of them.
Can we leap to 2015 now? Maybe we'll come back to Mike Bailey in a minute. Because my thing, I always think about in 2015, the Jenner moment. Caitlyn Jenner is on the cover of Vanity Fair, Woman of the Year, I do believe, and the trans rights movement just launches, and it's enormous, and the messaging is everywhere. What was that like for you, given that you? Well, I certainly assume that Jenner is an autogynephilic man, just as Laverne Cox, who was on Time magazine. What was that like for you, understanding autogynephilia and then seeing these men celebrated in such a way?
2015. Well, let me think.
Oh, did you notice it, first of all?
Well, of course. I mean, it was inescapable. The Caitlyn Jenner thing was everywhere in the media. So you would have to have been vacationing on Mars. I don't think I had much reaction to it. I mean, at this point, I had moved from gender identity to the gender identity clinic to special, to the clinic that assessed sex offenders in 1995 or 1996. And then I had retired in 2010. So, my gender days were already long in the rearview mirror before Caitlyn Jenner came out. So I just thought, well, I didn't have a strong emotional reaction to it.
So you didn't have a sense of foreboding that something bad is about to happen, celebrating autogynephilia in this way?
I don't think the people who were celebrating her knew they were celebrating autogynephilia.
That's the
In fact,
point.
I'm quite sure they didn't.
That's my whole point.
And for the record, I'm not saying that Caitlyn Jenner is an autogynephile. I would never diagnose anybody with any condition, over the media. Just to be clear on that. I don't know what to say about it. I had no particular reaction to it. I wasn't politically oriented at that point, or really very much now either. And I think the Caitlyn Jenner episode was still well before the point at which the activists completely reframed transsexualism as a political problem rather than a clinical problem. That was when I really kind of pricked up my ears and realized, oh, things have totally changed. The activists are now saying transsexualism is a political problem. It's a matter of political oppression. It's not a clinical disorder. That was when I thought, oh, wait a minute, things have really changed.
And so then WPATH, because WPATH, their de-psychopathologization campaign started in 2010, and that's when they made trans natural and healthy, not a paraphilia, not a mental disorder, natural and healthy, and it's a human right to access hormones and surgeries. Are you saying that that all just totally passed you by because you'd retired?
Well, I hadn't retired from doing human sex research, but I wasn't actively involved in researching gender identity disorders. So, things that WPATH, I had very publicly resigned from WPATH many years prior. So, anything they did to me was like, well, that's what they're up to now.
For those who don't know, could you let people know, I presume you saw the horror show, well, I've no doubt you watched it in close proximity to what happened to Mike Bailey. He effectively brought out autogynephilia from your kind of academic research in 1989 to the masses, well, in a smaller mind, but to the public, with The Man Who Would Be Queen. And I presume that was an unnerving experience. Could you just tell our listeners who don't know about that, just what happened there?
That was the last wave,
Well, a professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, as I mentioned earlier, had discovered my writings, which up to that point were quite obscure, and promoted them in a book that he wrote. It meant to be a popular book, a trade book on cross-gender identity anatomically normal people. And part of it was about the homosexual type of gender dysphoria. A large part of it was about the autogynephilic type of gender dysphoria. This enraged some high-profile trans activists. I won't, since they're public figures, I won't say what diagnostic category they're in. But so they started a campaign to try and get him fired from his job, and they really did make his life very unpleasant. So, as to my reaction at that time, I was horrified that somebody should have gotten into such difficulties because they liked stuff I had written enough to try and write about it themselves and promote the idea. I felt guilty. I kind of had survivor's guilt, although I hadn't actually done anything bad, but I just felt so terrible. This man, because he liked my work, is having people doing everything in their power to get him fired from his job. It really was, a very nasty episode. Not to mention how it was for Mike Bailey. But
they
for
called
me,
him a rapist, or they said he was a sex abuser. They really threw everything at him.
Everything they could think of. They went bonkers. I think they were probably these were very successful individuals in their professional lives, and were also living as females in their professional lives. And I think they felt that they were on the brink of total victory. And here somebody comes along and potentially screws everything up. So naturally, they went into a rage.
And that's very much a microcosm for trans activism. It's the same, what happened to Mike Bailey is what happened to wider society when trans activism launched. Trans rights had to viciously destroy anyone who mentioned autogynephilia, because you cannot build a rights movement on autogynephilia. You can't build it on a paraphilia. It's not going to be an easy sell. Do you see the way, I see modern trans activism as being largely an autogynephile rights movement, and then the contagion just spiraled out and sucked in a whole bunch of innocent kids muddling through puberty? Do you think that's an accurate description?
It's really hard for me to sort those two things out. I mean, the autogynephilic input into trans activism has been documented by other people who've tracked down this group of high-profile autogynephiles who met in some place in Indonesia called Yogyakarta, and they had the money from somewhere. Well, some of these people were billionaires, but so they hired some famous law firm called Denton's, which gave them political advice to keep this discussion out of the public forum and work behind the scenes with politicians, which I think was, from their standpoint of view, very prudent, because public discussion of it was not the way to go. So that was one phenomenon. How that tied into the rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort is something that I don't know, or how it tied into the rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort. I've often thought it was strange that the trans activists who were primarily autogynephiles should concern themselves with children. I think it was politically a bad move. I mean, if there was anybody who was going to get their back up, it was going to be parents of kids who said, I think I want my breasts removed. They're really bugging me and I feel like a man. So I think they antagonized the group that was going to be not only most motivated to fight back, but the group who was going to be most sympathetic to the general public. And I don't know why they did that. Maybe they thought they had to circle the wagons and that nothing about cross-gender living could be questioned, that it needed to be a unified front all the way around. They could have said, you know what? We transitioned when we were adults, having tried everything else and been unsuccessful, and to save our lives from lives of total misery, we transitioned as grown adults who understood the consequences. This has nothing to do with 14-year-old girls. I think they could have gone that route. Why they didn't, I have no idea.
May I give you my theory and you can tell me whether you think it's plausible?
Okay.
My theory is all about hiding autogynephilia. It's that they built their rights movement they had to come up with a reason, a cause for being trans that was not paraphilia, sexual deviancy, anything like that. So they come up with gender identity, and then they come up with trans is natural and healthy and it's innate, and you just have this mismatched gender identity. But if it's innate, then you have to have trans children. And the very fact that you have trans children means that that further reinforces the fact that it's not a sexual deviancy and it's not a paraphilia. So it's the very act of trying to hide autogynephilia that meant we had to have this trans children gender identity movement.
I think that's a good hypothesis. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that could have started the rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomenon, but it would certainly have been a good rationale for latching onto it once it was underway.
I have more to say. I didn't get there.
Okay.
So that's the trigger, though. You see, so you've got to push the idea onto society that what makes you a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl is a gender identity. This is a mad idea, and it's completely new, and you have to force it on all of society. So you do that through a huge media campaign. We've seen you put it in schools. You teach children as young as kindergarten. You read them the book I Am Jazz. So you push this messaging really aggressively because you're desperate to hide autogynephilia, and then you trigger a social contagion because the idea itself is so contagious. If you hate your body, that could be a sign you're trans. That's the messaging that they pushed, and that's every kid going through puberty.
Again, I think it's plausible. I think you need a historian of science or a historian of social movements to look at the data in detail and say, this year this happened, this year this happened, this year this happened. I mean, professional historians have ways of approaching things so that they minimize the chance that they're cherry picking data to fit their theories. I'm not a professional historian. I don't even know how a professional historian works, but I know there are such people. So, for me, the connections between those two things, your ideas are as good as any, maybe better than most, but I don't know the chronology well enough to say, yeah, that fits exactly what happened in this year, and then this year, and then this year.
In fairness,
good enough.
I'm one of the old, ifs, ands, or buts academics. I have to.
In fairness, Mia is phenomenally well researched in that field. Just for my own tuppence worth, insofar as if you look at things through the mental illness lens, I know that, like, if you meet, let's say, a group of alcoholics, they want to meet other alcoholics who also drink. They're very actively invested in the idea of, we all have to drink. Sure, life would kill you if you didn't. And so I can see how, just if somebody was mentally ill, for example, and if they had autogynephilia, they'd be thrilled to come across a kid who said that they were really trapped in the wrong body. They'd say, yes, just like me. Yes, it's so normative. It's loads of us. I can just see how that could really gain wings with people. But I want to go in another direction, if I could. WPATH, you said you'd left them years before, Ray. Could you tell us? Myself and Mia have been all over WPATH, well, for some time now. So could you tell us your experiences?
I had belonged to WPATH. I had been to a couple of their conferences. At the point when I was attending, it was still mostly run by, clinicians, professional clinicians. There were a small number of transsexuals attending, but they were not in the majority. I resigned during the Mike Bailey controversy, which we've already talked about. The accusations against him by the trans activists triggered various, I guess, professional bodies or whatever to look into Mike, all of which exonerated him of anything. But during this period when he was being looked at by various bodies, somehow WPATH chose to involve themselves in it. They wrote some letter or something. This enraged me, totally enraged me, because the matter was under investigation. They were in no position to know all the facts of the matter, but they were choosing to involve themselves in an investigation of an academic without having any knowledge of the circumstances. And this just, I was just enraged, as I said, and I thought, oh no, 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 no. And so I resigned. I forget how I managed to make sure that my resignation letter would become public, but I did somehow, one way or another. And then finally, oh yeah, some trans activist put it on her webpage, which still exists as a zombie webpage, although she's dead. So whenever I need to see what's in that letter, I just go to this person's webpage, and she saved it for me, whereas I had, kept no record of it.
I can't believe I haven't read it. I'm going to read it right after this interview. I can't believe I didn't know about this.
Well, it's just what you would expect. First, I give my credentials. I've always been strongly in favor of clinical attention for blah, blah, blah. You have to always give your credentials first. Nevertheless, and then it was about how angry I was that they had chosen to involve themselves in an investigation of a person that they had no knowledge about the circumstances.
Sounds very W-Path to me. Modern day W-Path anyway. I want to go back to, we did just cover somewhat how to treat autogynephilia, and I know it's outside your area of expertise, but my question from the cultural political slant is, this rights movement was something, it's like a kamikaze mission or something. They just basically torpedoed societal acceptance as thoroughly and completely as possible with the approach that they took to this rights movement. And so I've always understood that you lean towards medicalization as being a good option for some autogynephilic men, but now that societal acceptance is so low and is going to continue to plummet, do you still think that it's a good idea for these men to take this medical path?
That's a very good question. And in fact, I was thinking about that issue when I was, taking 20 minutes before starting this interview to think what I would say. And you've asked me exactly one of the questions that I thought I might be asked. In the time frame in which I was in the business, the number of patients who were transitioning was microscopic compared to what it was now. I worked in a clinic that was the only clinic empowered by the province of Ontario to approve reimbursement for sex reassignment. And we also did this for other Canadian provinces, 5 or 6 of the others who didn't have their own gender identity clinics. So out of most of Canada, we were approving for surgery maybe 10 patients per year. 10 patients per year. And we assessed 1 new patient per week, basically. So it was a very small number of patients we approved. Furthermore, we were gatekeeping on steroids. I mean, our patients had to live as the opposite sex for 2 years before we considered them eligible for sex reassignment procedures. And during these 2 years, they had to either work or attend school in the opposite sex role, and they had to come and provide us with documentation that proved they were doing this. So it was the number of patients that we approved I shouldn't say encouraged, because we never encouraged patients to transition. We said, if you want to pursue the idea of transitioning, this is what you have to do. We never said you should transition. So that was the context in which I developed my attitude, which I still hold, that for some highly selected group of patients for whom nothing else has worked and who are mature enough and old enough to understand what they're doing, yes, for some of these patients, transition does give them a better overall quality of life. And I haven't backed down from that, and I never will back down from that, because that's the evidence of my own senses. Now, if I were talking to a patient now, I might have to say, look, if this were 30 or 40 years ago, I might say, go for it. But you have to understand that now this has become such an issue in society that it might or might not maximize your overall quality of life to transition. And this might seem unfair, but life is unfair.
I saw a quote of yours where you said, it was quite interesting, it's irrelevant whether a man can become a woman or vice versa. What's relevant is whether individuals tormented by the desire to be the opposite sex are happier when they present that way, and whether or how much the majority of society is willing to accommodate this. And it's this that, Mia has highlighted. Now that society is looking like it's less and less likely or able to accommodate it, everything has changed. As well as that, I think arguably our understanding of autogynephilia, now that it's in much bigger numbers, it can be studied perhaps more extensively and more in depth. And perhaps there's other, and this is where I want you to answer on, Ray, there's other aspects of being autogynephile that might have been unstudied previously. Like, for example, what are the links with maybe sadism or masochism or narcissism? As well as that, what are the links with autistic thinking? And as well as that, there's a few other things. But first of all, I wanted to ask about that.
Don't rush me.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to distill a question out of him.
I can see why you had trouble. What I wanted you to ask is, society is less willing to accommodate, arguably. It certainly seems to be increasingly less willing. As well as that, there seems to be some traits that are quite antisocial with autogynephiles. Are you not?
Oh, gee, I don't know. Some traits that are antisocial. Because I worked in a clinic that saw every kind of patient, I think I have a kind of cross-sectional experience that very few people would have now. The clinic I saw was approving payment for people who wanted sex reassignment. So we saw all kinds of people. You could, of course, if you wanted to, pay privately for surgery, but even rich people like free stuff. So I saw a wide cross-section of people, and a lot of the things that I see online, people saying, oh, they're all pedophiles, they're all this, they're all that. No.
I thought the likelihood of having one paraphilia makes it more likely. I'm not saying pedophilia, but it makes it more likely you'll have another paraphilia.
Yes, but I think, yes, that's true, but I think you have to, it clusters. If you have a given paraphilia, it makes certain other paraphilias more likely, but it doesn't make every kind of paraphilia more likely. I think autogynephilia, for sure, makes masochism more likely. I do not think it makes pedophilia more likely. Now remember, I was 15 years in a clinic for gender patients and 15 years in a clinic for sex offenders. So I think if there was some substantial overlap of pedophilia, yeah, I would know. And I can recall maybe 3 or 4 patients who were autogynephilic and also, I think coincidentally, were pedophilic.
Oh, what about, you said masochism, what about sadism?
Probably, yeah. I mean, there have been some serial killers who cross-dressed. Yeah, there've been a handful of them. Sure.
And what about exhibitionism and voyeurism? Is there an overlap there?
They have a certain kind of peculiar exhibitionism, which is not flashing the penis, which would be kind of self-defeating, but they might flash, they might contrive to show somehow that they have panties on underneath, or they might expose their buttocks to a strange woman if they think they have particularly feminine buttocks. But that's, as I said, it's a peculiar kind of exhibitionism. It's not flashing open your raincoat and showing your penis to, a strange female on the subway.
And what about transvestism then and exhibitionism? Is there an overlap there? Because I'm just thinking we opened up women's spaces to these men. Any man can walk in and say, I'm a woman. And that just, to me, opens up our spaces to exhibitionists. But is there an overlap between cross-dressing and exhibitionism?
Well, I think you could make an argument that cross-dressing is a form of exhibitionism. But as I've just indicated, I don't think there's an overlap between cross-dressing and flashing your penis kind of exhibitionism.
That's the type I'm talking about, because that's what they're doing in all these changing rooms. It's just open exhibitionism.
That could be. That was not happening in my day because it just wasn't happening in my day. In my day, the patient's ideal was to pass so well that they were undetectable.
Okay, that brings me perfectly to what I want to ask next. I meant to look. I read a tweet of yours that made me laugh a year or two ago. I can't remember. I meant to refresh my memory before this, but then I didn't have time. And somebody had made a compilation video of a bunch of autogynephilic men and the things that they had posted online. And you wrote a tweet saying you just couldn't believe the kind of content that these men were publicly sharing on the internet these days. And my question is there some sort of self-delusion that they don't see what we see? With autogynephilia, is there something happens that they cannot see what we can see in these videos?
Absolutely. I think that it's very, very common for autogynephiles to get dressed and look in a mirror and think, ooh, not bad. And whereas anybody else would think, it's a guy in a dress and a wig. I don't mean to say that to ridicule them. I would not want to be an autogynephile. I really would. But it's true that, their perception of how good they look as females is very much distorted by their desire to look like attractive females. And I don't think this is a unique pathology. I think many people in many different situations have their perceptions distorted by what they want to see. So I think it's just part of a larger human propensity.
As well as that, there's anorexia, anorexics who think that they're fat and, body dysmorphics. Like, that would be quite common, that they genuinely think that they have fat thighs or something like that, and they're a bag of bones when they look in the mirror.
Yeah. This is the opposite, though. They're seeing something.
Yeah. They're seeing that would be as if anorexics were fat and looked in the mirror and said, wow, am I ever skinny?
But it's stemming from the same point in my world, insofar as it's their fixation. If you follow me, their fixation is.
I do follow you. There is I think for those of us who are not autogynephilic, it seems as if there is an obsessional flavor to it. Yeah.
That's why I've thought a lot about autism and autistic traits around autogynephilia. And people spoke so much about ROGD and autistic traits, and I agree. But then since I've met a very large number of people who've transitioned, and I've really seen a very, very notable prominence in autistic thinking. And I think it wasn't massively highlighted back in the old research, and I think it's an issue.
That's quite possible. One of the points I should make about my own clinical experience was that the clinic where I worked was a tertiary referral center. Typically, a patient went first to their general practitioner. The general practitioner referred them to a psychiatrist in general practice, and the psychiatrist referred them on to my clinic. So a lot of patients probably, I shouldn't say a lot because I have no way of knowing, but I'm going to say that patients with other kinds of readily diagnosable mental disorders might have been screened out before they ever got as far as my clinic.
Could I ask, because I think it's also got neglected in the research, and I'd like to know your views. And I can see why. When somebody comes to me and they might have alcoholism, I'm focusing on the individual, the same with anorexia. The trans widows feel like they were written out of history. They feel like they were ignored when the clinical assessments and evaluations were happening. And in a way, they were almost part with players, if you follow me, in the clinical assessment when their lives were arguably devastated by the autogynephiles, medical transition. What's your view of the entire trans widow issue? Because it's huge.
Well, I was always sympathetic to them, and in fact, I was asked to do one of these, online interviews by some organization for trans widows, and I did the interview. And during that interview, I expressed my sympathy for their position. I might say parenthetically, their position seems to me not entirely different from the position of women whose husbands come out as gay and decide to end the marriage. But maybe the wives of the autogynephiles are slightly more traumatized because their husbands try to engage them in their paraphilia, whereas wives of gay men do not try to engage them in their sexual activity. Anyway, yeah, so I've always been sympathetic to them. Now, I have been online, of course, accused by trans widows of ignoring trans widows and not having done anything to help them. The fact of the matter is that when I was seeing patients, patients would usually present at the point at which their marriage was breaking up or had just broken up or was going to break up shortly. And the wives really didn't have that much motivation to ask to be seen at our clinic because the situation was resolving itself in the real world. So we did not very often see wives of gender dysphoric men, not because we wouldn't have seen them. I can recall one or two wives. I can certainly recall one where we did see a wife, but mostly the patients, their wives didn't ask to be seen by us because their situation was resolving on its own with a marital breakup. And what reason would they have to come to us?
I always think it just would be so much better if autogynephilic men did not get married. It's so catastrophic. You just blow up the lives of your whole family, your wife. Like, imagine children. Your father transitions as an autogynephile. So destructive.
I agree with you 100%. And as a clinician, I would have no problem in saying to a autogynephilic patient who was starting to get gender dysphoric, I would have no problem cautioning them against getting married. That being said, I was a very atypical clinician. Most clinicians would rather have their fingernails pulled out than actually tell a patient what to do, even when the patient is clearly asking to be told what to do.
Do you think autogynephiles are more likely to remain transitioned or more likely to detransition because of disappointment with the medical treatment?
The autogynephiles I remember who detransitioned, and it wasn't a lot of them because, as I've already indicated, we had such a stringent procedure for approving them that it really minimized the chances of detransitioning. But the autogynephiles I remember who detransitioned, I think it was always the same cause. They got involved with a woman, either a new woman or they got re-involved with a former wife, and that was the reason that they decided to go back to the male role. It was a chercher la femme.
Sounds like an unstable detransition, though. Sounds unstable. I remember reading in Men Trapped in Men's Bodies about the cycle that autogynephilic men can get trapped in, where it's an erotic urge that propels them to want to be women, and then they take estrogen and hormone blockers, and that removes their sex drive and then removes their desire to be a woman. So then they detransition and they go off the drugs, and then the erotic, the sex drive comes back and the urge comes back, and they get trapped in this cycle. Did you see that?
Yeah, but I saw it. I remember one patient very distinctly, very intelligent, very articulate, very honest guy, and he had gone through exactly this kind of cycle. He'd get extremely gender dysphoric. He'd start to make moves in that direction. Then he'd go back to backing up and being in the male role. But I can't say that I saw it a lot. I only bring this up about the detransitioners because it struck me that there was this uniformity of why they detransitioned, and did they ever then break up with their wives a second time and retransition? Not to my knowledge, but
Was narcissism a common feature?
I think it depends on how you define narcissism. I think personality theorists who work in narcissism have a definition of narcissism that might not be met by autogynophiles who are just autogynophilic and nothing else. Now, you could say autogynophilia is by definition narcissism, because if you're looking at yourself and thinking, whoa, I'm so hot, I have to masturbate now. But I don't know that that's what people have in mind when they talk about narcissism in other kinds of individuals.
I don't know if you have any other questions, Mia. I'm down to ask Ray about the DSM and Alan Francis and hepaphilia, and remember the chem.
Okay, well then I have one more on autogynephilia, and then we'll go to Alan
We'll line
Francis.
you up.
My last one is, I feel like we can't have this conversation unless we talk about porn. And so I'd like to, one question is porn a major factor or a minimal factor in this? And then related to that is, a couple of years ago I read this very interesting Substack article, and it was a young detransition man who claimed that he had suffered from rapid onset autogynephilia, and it was from watching porn, trans type porn, sissy porn, I don't know, while he was a teenager, while he was developing. So is porn a factor, and do you think there's any validity to this idea that we could have rapid onset autogynephilia?
Okay, that's a couple of different questions. I'm going to start by saying that long before I started seeing patients in 1980, there were autogynephiles. There was no internet, let alone internet porn. And once, when I wanted, because of research I was doing, I went on a mission to find female pornographic magazines, and I was all over Toronto, and I had a hell of a time finding any. So there were plenty of autogynephiles back in the day when it was not easy to even find print magazine porn of she-males, and there was no such thing as she-male video porn, or if there was, you certainly couldn't get it in the comfort of your home online. So I do not think that pornography historically has been a cause of autogynephilia. I think it mostly develops somehow during childhood and in isolation from any other people. Okay? That's number one. Number two, with regard to rapid onset produced by porn, how do you know if it's rapid onset or rapid realization? How do you know if this is a desire being implanted or being revealed?
The argument that he was making, if I remember correctly, was he was defining rapid onset autogynephilia as not being real. Like rapid onset gender dysphoria is some kind of subtype that it just basically looks like it's a bunch of confused kids that got thrown off course by the messaging of transactivism. And he was suggesting rapid onset autogynephilia was this pseudo autogynephilia that he had experienced because of his porn exposure, and he snapped out of it. Because autogynephilia seems to be forever. Like, you don't just get over your autogynephilia, do you?
You know, it's hard for me to comment on individual cases.
Oh, just as a theory, does it sound plausible?
I'm trying to think of, I've seen patients who were clinically obsessional, who developed an obsessional notion that they were, for example, homosexual, who weren't homosexual at all. So yeah, you can. I remember one patient. How did it start? He was out in public doing something, and some man near him bent over to pick up an object off the floor. And by seeing this man bend over, he got this obsessional idea that I might be homosexual. He wasn't homosexual, but he became obsessionally preoccupied with this. So yeah, ideas that are not truly reflective of an underlying erotic preference can be entertained and become obsessions for a time. Nothing is 100% or 0% in human sexology. So, what you're saying is possible. I don't know. But going back to my earlier point about is something implanted or revealed, I remember one patient who, as a child, was watching a cartoon with a character called Elmer Fudd. You're probably too young to remember.
I remember
Fudd.
Elmer.
Yeah.
But there was a cartoon in which Elmer Fudd, who was like an anthropomorphic pig, cross-dresses as a woman, and the patient said it was like somebody hit me in the head with a brick.
Wow.
And that's why I'm saying, erotic preferences can be revealed suddenly.
There's
Interesting.
more than one way to read that, but that's very, very interesting. So many people who medically transition can pinpoint. I went downstairs and I watched a film and bang, or there was an interview, or I opened a newspaper. My dad was reading a newspaper and I saw a picture and bang, there's something that happens there. And is it being revealed or is something just been awakened? Well, we could go on forever about that. But I do, before we finish, I'm very anxious to talk about the DSM, if you don't mind. I know you were in the Sorry, we're really putting you through the ringer here. We're getting our money's worth, and we're not even paying you.
Check.
I'm very crass. But the DSM, the working group, you were on the DSM working group, if I'm right, DSM 4 and DSM 5 for gender dysphoria and sexual identity disorders. And we spoke with Alan Francis, which was very interesting. He didn't agree with us around gender issues. Then we spoke with Ken Zucker, who spoke to us about the DSM, working group, and he had a pretty horrifying story to talk about how the concept of hebephilia was taken out of the sexual disorder. So there's pedophilia, which is a paraphilia towards children, and hebephilia, if I'm right, is towards young teenagers. And that got removed in a very arbitrary way. Were you involved
At
in
the
that?
very last minute.
Yes, I was very much involved in all of that. I wrote a whole paper about it, actually. Once I had simmered down enough to be able to write a paper about it.
This was 5 years or something. Tell us the whole story. It was extraordinary.
Well, I can't tell you the whole story because essentially to be on the DSM-5, you had to sign like a non-disclosure agreement that you were not. I'm sure you know, but what had happened was I had made the existing and still existing definition of pedophilia in the DSM is that it's an erotic attraction or erotic preference for prepubertal children. And it gives a kind of guideline for what a prepubertal child is as 13 or younger. Well, that might have been okay for like 50, 60, 100 years ago, but 13 as a guideline for what's a prepubertal child is absurd now. So what I pointed out was, look, you're diagnosing people as pedophilic who don't meet your guidelines for pedophilia. My suggestion was change the definition of pedophilia so that it refers in some realistic way to prepubertal children, and add a diagnosis of hebephilia, which I didn't invent on the spot. People had talked about it before. Add a diagnosis of hebephilia for people who are most attracted to children in the early stages of puberty. That way, you would not be diagnosing any more cases overall. I think you'd be diagnosing the same number of cases overall, but you'd be diagnosing them more accurately so that you could differentiate between those who are attracted to prepubertal children and those who are attracted to pubertal children. And I should point out that by early puberty, I mean what are called Tanner stages. You can look it up. Tanner stages are very specific definitions. Children in Tanner stages 2 and 3 look very much like children. They have breast buds or tiny little breasts. They're not hot 17-year-old cheerleaders, okay? They still look like kids. This was elicited a great deal of resistance from certain factions within the American Psychiatric Association for various kinds of political reasons and what we might call guild reasons among forensic psychiatrists. And so the proposal was shot down like at the last minute, maybe not the last minute, but certainly the last day in a closed meeting, a closed secret meeting. And they elected to stay with the diagnostic criteria the way they were. And that's how they are to this day. And what had really angered me to the point that I finally wrote an article about it was that there was a section of the DSM intended to be for, what was it called, conditions requiring further study. So they could have made the decision to say, well, look, there's not enough evidence yet to regard hemophilia as a distinct paraphilia, so we're not going to make it a diagnosis, but we're going to put it in the section for conditions requiring further study. No, they didn't do that either. They just wanted the whole idea killed, and that's how they went.
And, to remind our listeners and viewers, the DSM seems to work by almost eminent experts in the field get together and effectively vote it in. So if everybody voted there was a God, you could stick in there is an existence of God. Like it seems to be really consensus by vote almost. Am I right in how these conditions get in?
Just think of the taste of fermented
yeah, I mean,
milk.
basically, they put together a committee of experts, more or less by reputation, and the people who accept the invitations, which probably most people do because it looks prestigious, accept the invitation to be on a working group for revising the DSM. But it's not, I mean, there isn't some kind of objective test. There's no entrance exam.
It
There's
just
no
means
there are no qualifying heats.
It feels like it's very conditional on the thinking of the time. That's why I brought up God, because in a certain kind of society, not believing in God could be considered pathological if you got this right group together, if you follow me. And the same about so many of these diagnoses are increasingly subject to the thoughts of the day. It feels too unscientific for me.
Well, that's probably true, but when was it ever different? I mean, the DSM obviously does not arrive by divine inspiration. You have to get people together to write it, and that's what they do. I mean, that's how it is now. It's probably how it always was. Well, maybe not the first DSM was probably even worse, but that's how it's been for a long time. You assemble a committee of people who, by their reputation or by their publication records, are considered experts in their field. You put together enough of them to have what you consider a sufficient number of people, and then they take it from there.
And how much political pressure is there? Because I tracked gender transsexualism to gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, and obviously with a focus on WPATH and trans activists, and you can see the pressure. You can see them like WPATH concocting gender dysphoria specifically so that they can make trans natural and healthy, de-psychopathologization campaign, and they're writing these. They form the work group and then they're submitting their papers to the APA to get gender dysphoria, and then lo and behold we get gender dysphoria. So in my mind there's an awful lot of political shaping. Is that true?
Well, first place, I think it probably depends on what disorders we're talking about, but you're interested in gender identity disorders, so we'll stick to that. I was the chairperson of the sub-work group for paraphilias, and I personally resisted pressure pretty much from outside. In one instance, I kind of gave into it, which I regret now, but I basically resisted external pressure. I remember there was one trans activist who was wanting to know when I was going to meet with her, and the answer was, well, I'm not. I think because the diagnosis of transvestism, which still exists in the DSM, was under my purview, so I think they thought I should meet with them, and I had no intentions of doing that. But with the sub-work group for gender identity disorders, was probably more friendly to getting feedback from the community. Now, were they actually dictated to by the community? I think that probably would be exaggerating the situation somewhat, but they certainly were a collection of clinicians who were, let us call it, sensitive to the feelings of the transgender community.
My feeling is that they were dictated to because they did everything that WPATH demanded. And if you look at the ICD, the World Health Organization's classifications, the trans activist group WPATH and another trans activist group, they came up with gender incongruence, and they came up with the idea to move this out of mental disorders, and they even came up with the idea to create a whole new section just for gender incongruence so that it could be a disorder of sexual health. You can see them doing it in their meetings and in their papers, and then these big organizations, the APA and the World Health Organization, just do exactly what they're told. You can see it.
Oh, it's tempting to paint the situation as that bad, and I can understand the temptation. And I know all of the people who were on the gender identity disorders sub-work group. I did not attend any of their meetings. I'm sure they would not have wanted me to attend their meeting. I didn't want to attend their meetings because I knew pretty much what they were up to, and I knew it would not have been a happy experience. On the other hand, they had their own egos and their own agendas, and they might have corresponded to some extent with what WPATH wanted. I don't think it was as simple as them taking their marching orders from WPATH. I can understand why people might want to see it that way, but these people had their own egos, as I've said. And also, they produced documents along the way that were published that explained what the rationale was for this or that. Now, with regard to the name change from transsexualism to gender dysphoria.
Or gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria.
Yeah, to gender. That was probably the main thing they did that I didn't really object to. And there was a reason for that, which was there are degrees of gender dysphoria that are very uncomfortable to patients, that affect their quality of life, but they're either intermittent and fluctuating or not severe enough to want to call them transsexualism. So I thought, I have no problem with changing the name of the diagnostic entity to gender dysphoria, because now you have a diagnosis and a reason to reimburse, let's say, clinical psychotherapy for patients who really are gender dysphoric enough to be unhappy, but you wouldn't want to diagnose them as transsexual. So that was the one thing that committee did I didn't object to for that reason.
And that's the thing that I object to the most.
Yeah.
Well, because you're coming at it from a political point of view, and I understand that, and I'm not coming at it from a political point of view.
We could
not necessarily a political point of view, though. For me, it's because when they changed it, and this is WPATH didn't even hide it. This was their goal. The idea was to change it from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, so that you shift the pathology to the distress that you feel. Not the being trans, not the identity. That's perfectly natural and healthy, and you're shifting the diagnosis to the distress. And from that point on, the only thing you can do to manage that distress is hormones and surgeries, because you can't help them reconcile body and mind, because that's not a pathology, that's healthy.
This is not unique to gender identity disorders. The paraphilias, the diagnostic criteria for the paraphilias, which were changed to paraphilic disorders, it always had a distress criterion. Well, I shouldn't say always, because I don't recall DSM-1, but a distress criterion, either subjective distress or harming other people, has been part of the diagnostic criteria for paraphilias for a long time. So adding a distress criterion for gender identity disorders is not something new, and it's not something unique to that diagnostic category.
It's not a criterion, though. It's the entire diagnosis. The distress is the diagnosis, and it's deliberately done to shift the diagnosis from the identity. Because if the pathology is the identity, then you should treat the identity and try and reconcile body and mind, overcome the cross-sex identity, They shifted it deliberately to the distress, meaning the identity is healthy and the distress is what you treat with hormones and surgeries. That was what they did it for.
Well, I don't know how you would know what they did it for unless you asked those 4 people specifically, why did you do this? Just because some other organization who did not have members, here I'm defending a committee with which I basically am unsympathetic. Okay, so but I have to step in and say, to know why they did it, you would have to have an honest conversation with them. Not that that would ever occur, but you can't, because there are documents and people on some group out here claiming this is what we want. That does not necessarily mean that that's why the people on the committee did it.
So it's just
they look like they're coordinated that are not actually coordinated, or that are coordinated for a different reason than you think.
So it's just a complete coincidence that WPATH do this and demand this, and then they did that, but for totally different reasons. But they did what WPATH said.
I wouldn't say it's a complete coincidence, because you have changes in the zeitgeist, which are going to affect what WPATH is saying, and which are also going to have affected what the Gender Identity Disorders Subcommittee was doing. So I wouldn't say they're completely unconnected, but I would say the connection might be more that they were operating in a common zeitgeist, rather than you have WPATH writing down, this is what we want in terms of diagnostic labeling, passed to this subcommittee and have them simply copy it. I don't think that happened.
Okay. It just looks like it. It looks like it to me.
I don't deny that it looks like it. I'm just saying.
I'm very suspicious at the least, at the very least.
I remember a quote from you, Ray, where you said that was done for political reasons. And I hopped on it at the time.
Well, I would have to know exactly what that means. That was done for political reasons.
Yeah. I'll tell you the context of it. It was the move from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, and it was to kind of basically pacify the more activist cohort. And it wasn't that you were against it as such, but it was primarily a political reason. I can look it up now if you like.
We interviewed Ken, who was on the committee, Ken Zucker.
Yeah.
And he didn't deny it. He just said he didn't see anything. He didn't see that it was a big deal. Sure, we did gender dysphoria, change of name, just didn't really see that it was a big deal.
Well, because Ken is looking at it as a clinician.
Yeah.
And you're looking at it as an activist. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just a different perspective. From Ken's point of view, the same people are getting diagnosed. So what's the deal?
Yeah, you see, I'm looking at it from 2020.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it from a clinician's point of view, and I think we lost an awful lot. If we had gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder, we would have something we could work with. Because some people might have a deluded identity and you could work with that, and some people might have distress over their gender issues, and I think that would be a workable diagnosis. You could have one and you could have the other, you could have both, but having one or the other, we've really missed, I think, a lot.
And in my defense, I'm looking at it from 2025, where we've had this explosion.
I don't want to attack you. So you don't need to say in my defense.
In my No, but from 2025 we had this explosion. We had a massive psychiatric epidemic, and from 2025, my vantage point, I'm trying to make sense of how that happened. And one of the ways that happened is trans is natural and healthy. So we're going to put these people on the cover of magazines. We're going to celebrate them. We're going to promote this identity that is perfectly natural and healthy. And that stems from shifting the diagnosis to gender dysphoria.
Well, that's where I say, how can you prove that point? Lots of things were happening in this time frame.
Oh, it's not completely. It's just one of the factors, but it's an important factor.
From my perspective, I don't know how much more to say on this now. From my perspective, changing the diagnosis from transsexualism to gender dysphoria just made it possible to diagnose people who really have a mental disorder, but not of the level of calling it transsexualism. So it's like if you have a cold that's giving you sniffles, you have a cold, but you don't have
COVID.
pneumonia. Okay, so that's how I saw it. Now, while we're on the topic of, there's one funny thing about the DSM criteria for gender dysphoria that nobody points out, which is that it's silent on the matter of ROGD kids for the simple reason that the committee finished meeting and wrote its recommendation before there were ROGD kids. So so this committee was doing its thing in a certain historical time period, and you have to keep that in mind. Nobody yet, but somebody might attack the DSM and say, look, it's so incomplete, it doesn't have ROGD in it. Sure, because there wasn't ROGD. That phenomenon hadn't started yet by the time that committee had finished its work. So, again, I don't want to be seen as defending the work of a committee which did some things that mightily annoyed me, but ignored and annoyed me. But I think you have to be fair.
I think so too, you do. And I do think there's a lot we don't know, but we're getting to know more every day. And we're certainly putting things together. I think so long as we remain open-minded, I think we will get further and further into what happened. I could talk to you all day about that move from transsexualism to gender identity and then to gender dysphoria. And I also think that the treatment is one day going to be considered something like lobotomies, that this is a sledgehammer to smash a nut, and there are better ways to handle things. But we can't, sadly, speak to you all day. But fabulous, fascinating conversation, Ray.
I have a couple things I want to add. One is, at one point you were starting to say some encouraging stuff about now we can have more research. No, you're not going to have decent research on gender identity disorders for another 10 or 20 years, because it basically comes out of academia. Those are the people with the stat skills and the knowledge of how to do it, and it's a toxic topic. Even before I retired, I would have these bright-eyed students come in and they'd be so interested in gender identity disorders, and I'd say, you can research some other topic where patients will actually be grateful if you try to help them, and you won't be getting attacked. This is not the wonderful research opportunity you might think it is. I have to be honest about that. I am not optimistic that there is going to be. There are some heroic individuals like Mike Bailey and his students who do continue to do research in this area, but majority of universities, nobody's going to touch it, because nobody wants a lot of trans activists phoning their deans or whatever and trying to get them fired. So it's going to be a while before there is any serious research with regard to descriptive pathology or maybe etiology. So I guess that was the one thing that one little downer that I felt I needed to add.
A pity, but it's true, sadly.
Yeah.
And, with regard to treatment, which I never really addressed, was psychotherapy. First place, I don't know if any psychotherapy has ever cured autogynephilia. It might help an individual to manage it. A patient who comes in and says, I'd really like to stifle this impulse because I love my wife, I love my children, I would like help in learning how to keep a lid on this so I don't I don't throw my life away for the sake of autogynephilia. And I think psychotherapy could possibly be helpful in cases like that.
And do you think we need to stop celebrating these men coming out as women then, because that's encouraging them to blow up their lives, that's encouraging them to succumb, I suppose, to their paraphilia rather than seek the psychotherapy route?
Yes, I'm sure that the media valorization of transsexuals has helped make the idea of psychotherapy less appealing. But there's one more little dash of cold water reality that I have to throw out, which is that how are you going to compel a patient to go to psychotherapy who doesn't want to? You can cut off all sources of third-party payment, either by a provincial government like in Canada or via a third-party insurance payer, but you can't stop patients from going to Thailand or whatever or paying for their own surgeries. So when people like the online commentariat, they have fantasies of some kind of society in which, I don't know, clinicians or somebody has some ultimate authority to stop people from having sex reassignment surgery. You can't stop people because they'll go abroad and do it. So
They'll do it to themselves.
I agree. I was just reading about Tabletop Brown because I'm writing about the people who have their healthy legs amputated, and that guy, was chopping off legs in his garage.
I met him, actually.
Did you meet him?
Yeah, I
okay,
did.
can you just tell me about him? Just that's where we'll end it.
Then we'll finish it. Thank you.
With Tabletop Brown.
All right. I was invited to a conference at Columbia University in New York, and it was a conference for these apoteptophiles, so people who were preoccupied with wanting to have healthy arms or legs amputated, usually legs. For a while, it took me a while to figure out why was I invited to this anyway. I mean, I was happy to go there, but
what year was this?
Oh, damn! I would have to look that up for you.
Approximately. What decade?
It had to be before 95 because I was still working at the gender clinic. So before 95. Let's say we're talking around 1990.
Okay.
Anyway, so I was thinking, well, why was I invited to this? I'm going to tell this long story, then I'm going to forget my main point. I've already forgotten my main point. Oh, no, regarding Robert Smith. Oh, yeah. So I was trying to figure out why was I invited to this conference, and I eventually became clear. They thought that because I was an expert in gender identity disorders, that I could help them somehow get apotemnophilia treated in a similar way to transsexualism, and that I could help them, like, how would we set up a protocol analogous to the real life test for transsexuals of making them live as the opposite sex before you approve surgery? How could this be applied somehow to apotemnophiles so that they could have some clinical legitimacy for going to a surgeon and having some kind of socially approved amputation. So that's why I was invited. They thought I would have some practical advice to offer because of my experience in gender identity disorders. And I said to them, I'm still not getting to my main point, but so I said, well, there's a difference here in that, becoming the opposite sex, let's say becoming a woman, is not actually conferring a disability on the patient, but amputating a healthy leg would be conferring a disability on the patient. So the situation is quite different. Well, of course, they were all ready for that one, and they proceeded to regale me with stories of how differently abled people could manage just fine with only one leg. So they were ready for that.
But doesn't chopping a man's penis off make him disabled in a quite profound way?
Well, their answer would be, I want to become a woman. Is being a woman a disability?
But being a man without a penis is a disability.
But being a woman without a penis is not a disability.
But he's not a woman, he's a man.
Well, in their perception, they're women. So
but you are weakening their body. Objectively,
very much so.
You're weakening their body. But anyway, keep going.
Go.
Anyway, so it was at this conference that I think his name was Robert Smith, was it not? You might remember. And he was present there, and so I got to speak to him. I was a brief conversation. I remember him saying that, and this was I think he had already been prohibited by his hospital from doing any more of these amputations. But what sticks in my mind was that he said to me, oh, well, if I thought that a patient had any history whatsoever of fetishistic arousal with the idea of being an amputee, then I wouldn't amputate on them. And I thought, that's exactly how people used to talk about sex reassignment surgery, that they had this idea that if patients have any history of sexual arousal with cross-dressing, they would be ineligible for sex reassignment surgery. That idea was dispensed with. I mean, that was, to use the cliche, more honored in the breach than in the observance. And here was this guy talking about doing amputations of arms and legs with the same kind of way that people used to talk about.
Okay, but I mean, I've read him saying that, and he's either stupidly naive or he's just outright lying. And I came to the conclusion he was outright lying because he agreed to cut off the leg of a man called Greg Firth, who co-wrote the paper that defined apotemnophilia with John Money. John Money and Greg Firth co-wrote that 1977 paper. Smith agreed to chop off Firth's leg. He was the third one set to have his leg chopped off when the hospital in Scotland shut him down. He only managed 2, and then they shut him down before Greg Firth. That man wrote the paper about apotemnophilia. He was open about it being an erotic desire, and Smith agreed to chop his leg off. So I think he was just outright lying.
Well, in my days in gender, I certainly knew a lot of physicians, including surgeons, and if you think they go off and study all the relevant psychiatric literature before they make a decision about operating, you're talking about very different surgeons than I knew.
Oh, so you don't think he knew Greg Firth's history of helping John Money define
because
it?
Greg first had a book that the surgeon would have read it.
And he wrote a book, Amputee Identity Disorder.
Right.
He tried to get it turned into Amputee Identity
What makes you
Disorder.
think the surgeon would have read the book? These guys, they come in the morning, they scrub in, they do their surgeries by 3 or whatever. It's a different life.
I should be clear though that Robert Smith is separate from Tabletop Brown. Tabletop Brown was that man who was chopping legs off in his garage. Greg Firth again. Greg Firth and a man went to Tijuana, where Tabletop Brown was operating out of a filthy hotel room. They both wanted the legs chopped off. His friend went first. This Tabletop Brown chopped off the man's leg in a filthy hotel room. The next day or the day after, the man died of gangrene. Greg Firth then left Mexico, went to Scotland, and got Robert Smith to agree to it instead.
Yeah, I'm in no. I mean, obviously, I've been kind of, poking a little gentle fun at Robert Smith, and I'm not in favor. As I said to a room full of apotemnophiles, that I did not think that this was analogous to sex reassignment. So I'm not in favor of it, but I think it's quite plausible that the surgeon had not read Greg Firth's book.
Okay, I think it's almost I'm writing about this right now, so I would say this. I think they're the same. They're pretty much the same, except chopping off a leg is far less destructive to your health. And when you amputate an apotemnophile's leg, he actually becomes the object of his own desire. He becomes an amputee, whereas when you chop off an autogynephile's penis, he doesn't become a woman. He still is a man without a penis, and so he's probably less likely to lead a happy, fulfilling life than the apotemnophile.
It's an empirical question. I mean, I realize it might be very inconvenient. First place, I understand all the objections of many people to what's happening, and I wouldn't argue with them. But, it's just an empirical question. Are there any people who are perfectly happy that they made the decision to have vaginoplasty? Yeah, probably. I think I've seen some. They're inconvenient because, you never like to have your argument qualified by ifs, ands, and buts, and there are exceptions. Nobody wants this. It's messy, and it complicates discourse. But it's an empirical question whether people are happier after sex reassignment. Now, you could make the argument, and a few gender-critical feminists do, I don't care whether you're happy or not. I don't think you should be doing it. And I that's an argument. There's no reason you can't say that. No reason you can't say, I don't care whether you're happier. I don't think you should be able to do it. Lightning's not going to strike you. But they mostly don't want to argue that way. They mostly want to reverse engineer the pathology itself so that it fits with the conclusion they want to reach. And I have to admit, I find that mildly annoying.
Yeah, I hear you, but just to put it different, and I know we really should say goodbye soon, but I can't not say this point. I'm not a gender critical feminist, but I do think interventions should be measured with as much as we can, with an evidence base, with logic, with supported by research, and moving towards healthy interventions. We should be moving towards healthy, and that should be the overarching kind of impulse of any intervention. And I was quoted, I saw I was quoted because I said, I don't care if they're happy. Is it a good intervention? And I was misunderstood by that, because they were kind of, the people who were misunderstanding me said, oh, I think happiness does matter more than health. And I'm like, no, 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 no. That's not what I mean. People can say they're happy. They can say they're happy with their wife when it's quite visibly obvious they hate their wife's guts. People say a lot of things. You can't really judge something except by the assessments. What's the rate of depression? What's the rate of psychiatric admissions into hospital? What's the rate of prison? What's the rate of suicide? What is this as an intervention objectively? Let's look at that. I don't care whether you're happy, because frankly, your ability to assess your happiness is just like mine, probably very fallible. So I'm not that interested in whether they think it was a good decision. I'm interested in the actual, the objective evaluations that we can put on a larger scale now, because there's more people who are medically transitioning. And I think we can quite, with satisfaction, come to the conclusion this is not a healthy or effective or successful intervention in the larger sense. And I don't care whether they think it was a good one. I'm looking at the objective details.
Okay.
I knew you were going to say something like that. Anyway, I felt very important to say there's a difference between whether they're happy or not and whether it's a good intervention.
I don't know what to say to it. I mean, like I said, I'm not gender dysphoric. If I were gender dysphoric, I would want to be happy, But I think we're in a zero-sum game situation right now, and everybody's not going to be happy. We're in a zero-sum situation in which either gender critical feminists are going to succeed in stopping sex reassignment altogether, or they're not going to achieve that 100%. But there's not going to be any compromise, and there's not going to be a situation where everybody ends up happy. It's going to be a situation where there are winners and losers, and I that's how I see it.
Okay.
Wow, Ray, that was brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That was
really,
amazing.
really fascinating. Amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Now